Okay, I'm watching the number and it seems to have stopped. So that I'm going to take as a sign that we should get started. So good morning, everyone. I am Sharon Curran, the CEO of Lenape Valley Foundation, and I am thrilled to be here this morning. I'm even more excited to see already 160 people logged in, and we expect around 200. So I think that is a wonderful turnout for our event this morning. I want to thank the Suicide Prevention Task Force as our co-chair, co-partner in bringing this session today to Bucks County. I was looking in my email before I got started this morning of thinking that we've at least been doing this for 10 years. And so I was able to go back and find conference lists for the past 10 years, and it could have gone back a little bit further than that. It would require more research on my part. But the first conference that we hosted was in a room at the intermediate unit, and we had less than 50 people. In fact, maybe 30, and I'm sure some of you here today were there on that first one. So to move from an event at the intermediate unit in one room to where we have been successful in the past several years at having roughly 200 people a year is just a tremendous success. And I have to thank the Suicide Prevention Task Force and everyone here for supporting this project. It's encouraging. And at that point, when we started having the meetings and trying to plan a conference, it was hard to get people to attend. It was hard to get participation from everyone in different sectors of our world. So the fact that today we're able to do that is just tremendous. It also speaks to the work of the task force. I, over the weekend, was lucky enough to be at the NAMI Suicide Prevention Task Force event in Warminster, and what a great event, and how nice to see schools participating, provider organizations, families. It was really just a lovely event, and even during COVID, we're able to do that, which I think is remarkable. So we have a packed agenda this morning, so I want to get started with introducing a few folks to begin here. But the first thing we have is a survey that we want to do. And to start that survey poll, they're going to put it up on your screen for you. There we go. We're just trying to get a sense of who is here today. And so if you can click on one of these buttons, I'm a professional in mental health, I'm a professional in education, suicide has affected my family, I'm a survivor of suicide, suicide has affected someone I know, or I prefer not to say, or other. So if you could click on one of those now, we will get, and I'm going to click on mine right now, we will get a results of this back so that we can tell our speakers exactly who is here in our audience today. So the first person that I'm honored to introduce, and it's funny because Diane is here and you can see her you'll in just a second. Commissioner Marseglia has been just a supporter of ours from the very beginning in that very first conference at the intermediate unit. She is now the chair of the Board of the Commissioners in Bucks County and has entered into her fourth term. I'm going to go back to the poll results right now really quickly, and you see that lots of mental health professionals here. Education is probably second, and then people who it has affected their families are next. So thank you all. There will be more polls throughout the morning. But Diane, as I was saying, is in her fourth term on the Board of Commissioners. She's a licensed clinical social worker, so I always think of her as one of us, and has a history of working with children and families. So she comes with a lot of experience in our field, and I think has just been able to advocate for human services in general within Bucks County from a place that not everyone could do that, and really from her professional experience. Earlier in the week, I mentioned the NAMI Suicide Prevention Task Force event, and she was honored there for her unwavering work in suicide prevention and education. And I think that award, I want to bring it up again because I think that it deserves the recognition that she received. Diane is a lost survivor who has turned that into action and energy. And I admire her so much for her support of survivors in particular, but also her support of all of the efforts around prevention and education. So I'm going to turn it over to Diane for a few remarks, and then I'll be back.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Boy, that did my heart good to hear how much growth there has been in the past 10 years. And thank you for having me. Thank you, Lenape. I am so grateful that you do this every year. It's so important to this whole community, and I am thrilled you've asked me to welcome people and to be on board this fight with you. You know, my message today is probably a little repetitive to everything you're all hearing, but what I have been thinking about, of course, is the coronavirus. And what I've been thinking about that is how much things have changed since March, how much we've learned, how much we've grown, how much we've been able to accomplish, and how much better we are able to deal with that disease. And I bring that up because I think, wow, if we could do that with a killer virus, we can certainly do that to reach zero suicide. Last night, I was thinking, what if we could close this whole state country down for 9 months and just focus on suicide prevention? Well, I certainly think we would change the numbers, right? What a difference that would make. So, you know, although we can't do that, we can't lose hope because we will get there. It's just going to take us a little bit longer. I want you all to remember that we walked on the moon and we didn't think we could. We conquered smallpox that had killed thousands of people over the years, millions. We've gotten HIV to an undetectable level. We've invented psychotropic medications that allow people to live full lives. We've invented light bulbs and cars and computers. We've mapped the human genome so we can stop suicide. When my daughter died of suicide 16 years ago, there was far more stigma and there was much less information on this malady and the despair that comes when people are feeling suicidal. So we have come a long way, whether it's from 50 participants here to all the information we have gathered. I know sometimes some of the people out there may worry that, well, we keep seeing the numbers go up, but I want to assure you that we all knew that. We knew that as we brought light to this malady, that we were going to end up having numbers come up because they were going to become out of the silence of people's prayers as stigma went away. And I thank all of you for helping to let that stigma go away. So don't give up. Don't give up hope. Every day we get a little bit closer to zero suicide. There was a radio personality, Earl Nightingale, who once said, you know, don't not do things because it's going to take a long time to accomplish them. Time is going to pass anyway. So you might as well do something useful while it's passing. This is useful. Saving people's lives is useful. So thank you for having me, and remember not to give up hope. We are on that march. Thanks.
Thank you, Diane. You're exactly right. Think of the things that we have done in this country, and we can do this too. It's just a matter of our continued efforts. So thank you. I want to just review a couple housekeeping things of how the day is going to go. So to start with, type your questions into the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So we'll be answering your questions. We will try to take some at the end of each presentation as time allows, but we will also be answering them live in the chat. So if you enter something and you'd like to remain anonymous, just for your information, my understanding is that the questions come to our presentation panel. So they're not out to the whole, everyone on this Zoom call. But if you want a private answer, you know, to put that in there, and we'll make sure that we do that. The other thing with the Q&A is that if we can't get to everything and there are a lot of questions, we will make sure that we get answers out to everyone even after today. So just know that we're paying close attention to those, and we're really interested in the questions and the comments that you have. We do have some employees, experts, clinical staff in the background here to help us if there are answers to any of the questions that need, you know, some special expertise, or if you have, you know, a really clinical specific question. Again, we're not giving supervision here, we're just doing a presentation, but feel free to ask. The continuing education credits are at the end, and you will get a SurveyMonkey link at the end of the conference. You go in there, you answer the SurveyMonkey, and the last question in that will take you to a link where you can print out your certificate, your continuing education credit certificate. If you have problems, questions about that, again, let us know and we will help you with that. Next, I'm going to just move on to introducing Dr. Campbell because we want to stay on track this morning. And I think we're all really excited to hear from Dr. Campbell. So he has a impressive resume. And I have to say that, I'm just so thrilled to bring Dr. Campbell to Bucks County. He follows a long list of wonderful speakers. So no pressure this morning. We have just another fabulous expert in our lineup here. I'm going to give you the highlights of his experience and his career. And first of all, you will notice as soon as he starts speaking that he's from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, might have just a little bit of a Southern drawl. He is a co-chair of the national, he's the executive director emeritus of the Baton Rouge Crisis Intervention Center. He has done tremendous amounts of work in the postvention part of suicide prevention and postvention. What attracted us to him, and we really wanted to invite him, was because of his loss model of for survivors. And he's going to talk about that, so I will not get into the details of that. He has received a number of awards throughout his career for his work in suicide prevention. But I have to say, one of the things that struck me the most was that his model, the loss model, has been replicated around the world, and he's presented around the world and around the country. In fact, before we were on live today, he was saying the only state that he's not made it to in this is Hawaii, and that's because there were some cancellations. So I am sure that he's going to make it to Hawaii in the next couple of years here. But his model has been replicated in really diverse countries such as Australia, Singapore, Northern Ireland, Canada. So, my thoughts about that are, if it can be replicated in such diverse countries around the world, I'm sure that there's something we can be doing more with this here in Bucks County. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce you to Dr. Campbell and learn about the loss model. So thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Can you hear me okay? I hope you can. Maybe Sharon, wave your hand if you can hear me. Okay, good, because I'm kind of in a soundproof booth here for the rest of you. I hope you can translate my language well enough. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I want to begin by thanking Diane for her long-term commitment and making meaning of her daughter's death. Survivors have been the ones that have led us in all areas of this model of suicide. So I appreciate the chance to be with the foundation today, and also Bucks County Suicide Prevention team and the great work you do. And every time I go to Pennsylvania, I start looking for real estate because I just love it up there. So I appreciate being here. I want to give you a little bit of background and information. I want to see if I can activate the screen. And I wasn't successful at moving it. There was a moment where it said, okay, I think I see where I have to click it up here. I'm scared to death I'm gonna knock myself off the screen. So it says you can control the PowerPoint in a screen, and so far I'm not controlling it.
Just click, Dr. Campbell, just click once on the screen.
On anywhere on the screen?
On the PowerPoint area.
Okay, well, I'm doing
there
that.
You go.
But
you're in control.
Okay, now I'm controlling it. Okay, so many years ago, as director of the Crisis Center in Baton Rouge, I wanted to have a building where those who have been affected by suicide, such as Diane and her family and all those in the community, could come to get help. We were very active in our ability back in '98 to start going to the scenes of suicides and pointing people toward help. So I named it the Traumatic Loss Center. And I named that because I wanted the initials TLC, because I really think tender loving care is what people need following suicide. And so this building is still the building that we have the National Suicidology Training Center in today. And our weekly group still meets there every Tuesday night and has since 1981 met somewhere. But we've been in this building now since about '99. And this is also where we come to talk about suicide and drill down on this topic, because I got to believe that the hard work we can do, and I'd be happy to close the country for 9 months and only focus on suicide. I think that would be a great idea if we could pull it off. But the reality is most people are getting what they know about suicide not in a graduate program, because the vast majority offer no information about suicide. They're getting on-the-job training, and when I look at death reports from hospitals or inpatient treatment settings, what I find is they're getting absolutely very little to no treatment whatsoever for suicide. They get treatment for other presenting problems, but when they're admitted for a risk to self or others, they should be getting treatment for suicide. What happens, unfortunately, is so many leave the hospital and within 24 hours take their life using the method they described at admission when they were admitted for risk to self or others. So I created this model that you see on your screen to try and notice how, if we could, in fact, do all three of these areas, and I've actually created a fourth area I'll describe, we could create that zero suicide dream. And we could at least begin with zero increase. So I would say the prevention work that's being done in our country needs to increase. And prevention work is the hardest thing to do because it's hard to prove you've been successful. Because when a person doesn't take their life, they're a statistical non-event. But now that more and more people who have got this lived experience, who have survived where they should have died or when they intended to die, out there telling their stories, we have a better insight into what we can do to help those who do survive their attempt. But we still need to work with the families to understand those who died by suicide, and psychological autopsy is our best resource there. So we teach that at the NSTC in relationship with the American Association of Suicidology. Now, prevention work, when it's successful, can take a person out of that place where they have thoughts of suicide. So that reduces, if you will, in the circle, the need for intervention. Intervention would mean someone's in the process of dying. They've acted on their plan, they're moving toward death. Now, the suicidology world, the study of suicide, is full of a lot of terms that nobody can agree on. So I'm not going to continue to say words like suicidal, because nobody really can tell me what that means. No one has a similar definition. Does suicidal mean someone is about to die? Does it mean they're in the act of dying? Does it mean they're having thoughts of suicide? So I tend to use words that are much more descriptive, a little less wiggle room. Intervention for me would be anyone who's having thoughts of suicide, which may or may not have led to an attempt. And I've added this other term called post-intervention. One thing, Bill Gates' Microsoft programming always wants to hyphenate postvention when it shouldn't be. Schneidman, who created the term, always wanted it as one word, just like prevention and intervention. Post means after. So I put post with a hyphen to help Bill Gates' system understand the word and its meaning, but also to suggest that whether a person comes from an attempt on their own and they seek help, or they have an intervention and it's not voluntary and they seek help, post-intervention lets us separate those who have had an attempt from those who have died by suicide and left a group behind. Because postvention, the blues, if it looks blue to you, it blends to purple, an attempt on my part to make the colors look like the ribbons that survivors wear. But post-intervention would be to help those not die by suicide in the future. Postvention is to help those bereaved by suicide cope with their loss, find a way to make meaning of their loss, and actually create post-traumatic growth, which we see witnessed over and over in lots of other arenas, but also in suicide. And I would say that Diane is an exemplary example of someone who's done post-traumatic growth out of her loss. And we have these examples all over there in every community where there's been survivors who've gotten help, the help that helped them cope with their loss. So Loss Team was something that I came up with the year I was president of the American Association of Suicidology in '97. You had to have a presentation on some work you're doing that would be either a new idea or something that when it gets published, people might regard it as a new way of approaching something. I felt that postvention had been underappreciated, although Schneidman pointed to it, and you'll see a quote by Ed in a minute. He was my mentor. He's the man that founded suicidology in America and the rest of the world, really. Although others have studied and done things with suicide, Ed's the one that really brought it to the forefront in our country. And as a result, we became an AAS at a time when this was still a very new environment. So I'm appreciating the fact that I was trained by people that could help me. And I'm hoping I can pass some of that forward. So the history of the loss team is that I came up with this idea by looking at the difference between passive and active. Passive suggests that the survivor has to find help on their own. Now, in this model, what you see is someone dies, and that leaves an unknown number of people who are survivors. And then immediately what you have is a call to 911 or whatever emergency number, and you have a whole bunch of first responders show up. Eventually, law enforcement and the coroner show up. And at some point down the road, and that's what that line at the top represents, almost 4.5 years was the length of time elapsed between the survivor finding their loved one or witness in my community. 4.5 years was the average. And from that, we made referrals to our survivor suicide group, which is a weekly group, and it is today a peer-led group. Research has shown that peer-led support groups are very effective. Now, we have a mental health professional who's been, like myself, a 20-year veteran of the group who can do the assessment to make sure that we get people the right help they need. But the reality is, the ongoing truth is, the group is where most of the healing occurs because you have people in that group that are a little further along that path who can be the installation of hope to the newly bereaved, who see themselves as all alone, quite confused, and perhaps having years that they've suffered before they stumbled onto help. I wanted to change that paradigm. I wanted to shift the survivor more quickly toward help. And no matter how much training we did and how many brochures we handed out, the reality was people just could not be able to find the time at the scene to add to their already busy schedule referral to a resource. And then it still came from somebody who wasn't a survivor themselves. And I can't emphasize enough the difference between somebody who has been there and someone who is appearing to do something that's part of their job. A volunteer that shows up that has lost someone to suicide, saying this is where I went to get help, is to me the equivalent of a lighthouse on a dark, dangerous sea. And that lighthouse is pointing toward safe harbor. And I can assure you, any sailor in distress will follow the light beam of that lighthouse to get to safe harbor. So what I wanted to happen at the scene was, in addition to the regular first responders in the coroner, we'd have a community postvention response made up of survivors and mental health professionals, and all would be trained as paraprofessionals. And we were trained on crime scene etiquette. We were trained to know how to be at the scene and how not to create any problem if it did turn out to be a wrongful death, such as foul play. Every suicide has to first be investigated as a possible homicide. And as an assistant coroner myself, I can appreciate the importance of maintaining the crime scene etiquette and the integrity of the scene so that if there is foul play, it's not thrown out of court because of other contaminations at the scene or a chain of custody that's broke. Now, here's what I found out when I looked at our program prior to the loss team. When I looked at the data that we'd been collecting from survivors, because we were always a research facility since 1970. So I wanted to look. And so Doris Bland, who was on my staff, accumulated some research for her master's thesis. And she was able to identify 28 unique relationships that came in for help after having had a loss. And that was where we began. Now, that was a passive postvention model. And when I looked at that and looked at her data on 2 different samplings, the difference is either 3.4 years or 4.5 years. And 4.5 years was the largest number that we surveyed. So that turned out to be the number that I showed you in that earlier graph. Under the active, where we go to the scene, which is the LOSS team, LOSS, as you'll see, stands for Local Outreach to Suicide Survivors, with the word local being the most important. There we found that in a 3-year and in a 10-year average, the elapsed time between death and coming for help was less than 47 days. And that tends to be pretty much worldwide what we see. In some areas, it might be as high as 60, but that tends to be 60 days from the date of death because of a delayed response, not being able to go to the scene. Going to the scene makes a difference. I don't think anybody would say getting help later is better than getting help sooner when you can't breathe. Now, when we looked at the relationships who came in for help, we took a 7-year study, and this is what we found. 83% of the people were made up in the top 12 relationships. So the mother of the deceased, the sister, the wife. You'll notice that women are coming in more often than men, but then men take their life more often than women, but women attempt more often than men. I stop here because I want to say women have been the bridge builders toward resources historically in our country. Men have been the ones that burn the bridges down. So it's really hard to get men in. And what we found was by having men on our LOSS team, more men started to come for help. In the 5th position, we have a tie with friend of the deceased and son of the deceased. Now, David Brent's work up in North Carolina showed that the loss of a peer in the high school is the equivalent of the loss of a sibling. And that's why friend to me is an important place to pause. This is a non-familial relationship, but a person hurting so bad that they came for help. And I think that's really key to understanding how suicide affects a community, not just the family, which was a more historical approach to thinking about who was affected. The father of the deceased comes in that position, and then the brother, you see how the males are starting to come in. Then girlfriend, who's often seen as a disenfranchised griever and often is scapegoated or blamed for contributing to the suicide, just like spouse is. And then we have stepfather, and then we have cousin and fiance tied. These are also individuals that are further out on the family tree, and fiance is a disenfranchised griever, just like girlfriend. So I would say to you that these relationships represent 83% of the people that came in. So the historic idea was that there was 6 people who would come in for help. Now, we found that not to be true. Part of that's because we find so many more people at the scene to talk to. So the L is local. The local means that it's in the community, and it's up to each community to figure out how they're going to reach out to survivors in their service area. This isn't a franchise. People are free to decide how they reach out. It's a concept, it's an idea, and anybody can have it for free. Going to the scene is what we call the outreach. So that's what the O stands for. I've got a typo there. It should be an O for going to the scene, outreach. And then that suicide survivor is the last 2 parts of loss. And the team means that you have to have at least 2 people going. We wouldn't want one person going to the scene. It wouldn't be a team then. And I find that the people going to the scene have to have had these services so that they can speak to the fact that they've been in that boat on that ocean and they've found safe harbor. And they know safe harbor because they've gotten help there. And that's what's enabled them to be able to go to the scene. Now, I created a metaphor person. If you haven't figured that one out already, let me go ahead and make that clear. And so when I talk to people about self-care, because if you do this kind of work, you really have to be deliberate about self-care because you will wear yourself out. And all too many survivors want to jump to this almost immediately. They want to be altruistic. They want to help other people, but it distracts them from their grief. And I have found that this grief will live alive and as strong as it went in 30, 40 years out if it's not excised, if it's not taken out of that body and given a place to air out, a safe environment. So first of all, you got to have a good support system. And this applies to COVID. Look how this is challenged by COVID. That's why we're seeing so much crisis and death by desperation in our country right now. You got to have a support system. And I would define a support system in this situation as someone who doesn't just sit back and allow you not to show up. They come check on you. They're nosy. They want to know where you are, why you're not changing your clothes. And if you don't have people during COVID that are checking on you, you don't have a support system like I'm describing. We have to have people that are constantly checking on us and making sure we're okay, especially during COVID. And if you have a daily activities of living, well, boy, has that been compromised for the last 9 months. People are struggling to figure out, do I even get out of bed today? Do I go ahead and get cleaned up? Do I fix lunch? We have really had to struggle with creating schedules and activities of daily living to keep us active and thinking about life rather than checking out. Physical well-being is number 3. Well, telehealth and other medical innovations that have come up will probably be with us from now on because we're finding more people can get help for a more affordable price. And that may be a boon to both the physicians in our country as well as the clients. But if you're not deliberate about your physical health, if you're physically in pain right now and you're not doing anything about it, then you're not taking care of that leg of your 4-legged stool. And the 4th leg of the stool is the first one to go in a suicide crisis or any crisis. The things you do that give your life meaning, that adds value and importance in your life. If you lose that leg of your stool, and I suspect you lose it right away in a crisis, then you already have wobbled your stool. You've made it too unstable. So I want you to think about this picture and ask yourself, take your own inventory. Do I have the 4 legs of my stool all touching the ground at the same time? Is your stool wobbly and you keep putting sugar packets under one leg to try and get it stable when you go and sit on it? Then you need to add to that leg of that stool. So I challenge you to be deliberate about self-care. So I wanted to put that heads up in early on. I also want to share some information, and I keep getting a warning every now and then my computer system may be faltering. So please let me know if you're having trouble. Somehow, somebody come on a picture and wave at me that you can't hear. The survivors seeking treatment fell into the 45 relationships when we compared them to those who don't get the active model, which was 28. So we were seeing many more people at the scene than we ever saw when they had to find us. And those top 12 relationships made up 81 to 83% as we continue to check on numbers in other places as well. For each death, and this is important when you're building services, for each death, although we were seeing on average of 15 people at the scene, when I did a 6-year study of people who came to us, out of 257 suicides, or an average of 37 a year, we were seeing 1.45, or about 1.5 people per death actually came in for help. So this means that in every pool of survivors that are out there that we were seeing at the scene, 3 out of every 2 suicides came for help. And so that lets you have an idea of how you will grow in your group size. Our groups went from an average of 8 to 10 a week to 45 to 50 people coming, but they came for shorter periods of time because they came in sooner. And I'll show you some additional information about that. So what we do know about those who seek treatment following suicide, well, here's one of the things. Oh, I've lost control again. Let's see. There we go.
There you go.
So this is what we found out, that this is that ranking again of the top 12 relationships, and you just have to add them up to figure it out. But that the women were going to come in more often. Now, we've seen a blending of that since Lost Teams. We're seeing many more men come in now than we did before because men are going to the scene. So that's that installation of hope. Not only do you help the person at the scene realize you could come and get help, but by having a male at the scene, other men said, well, maybe I could go too. Too often we were getting men prior to loss who came in because their wife wanted them to come, not because they wanted to come. And it was really a step toward trying to keep the relationship from falling apart. But individuals who aren't working on their own grief will eventually find that place where the relationship is faltering. So the families that I find stayed together are the ones that each did their own grief work. Now, when I looked at these relationships, we created discrete relationships. So that's why you would see the brother of the deceased or the sister of the deceased instead of sibling. So that's what a discrete variable means. It doesn't give any wiggle room for who we're describing. And the majority of these, all over 17 years of age, came in for an assessment interview. 63% then went on to the support group. And the vast majority today go on to the support group. We're finding more and more that the people that come in, grief is their presenting problem, and they don't have an additional mental health issue that needs to be addressed. It's gone unattended. Let me give you some more insight into what we find. So when we're looking at, will having them come in sooner make any difference? So when we looked at that information, we had a standard deviation of 31.5. So what I want you to notice is, and I really apologize for any of this research stuff that the course everybody wanted to keep from taking, right? So overall, the average attendance was 17.8 sessions. So they didn't have to come every week, but it means that when they came, on average, when we pulled the numbers, they came about 18 times. And the range was from 1 to 208 times. That's why you got that giant standard deviation. But then we just wanted to dig a little further. So then we pulled out of that the people that had a loss team visit. Now here's the difference. The time frame, the amount of weeks they come is significantly shorter, but also the range, the standard deviation drew down tremendously. So this means that people are getting better faster because they're all having to do an exit interview when they leave. So the passive model had this 23 overall average before loss team ever occurred. And now we've cut that down to 13 with a much smaller standard deviation. So one of the advantages of doing this kind of research is it allows us to consult with communities that want to start loss teams and help them better plan the resources in the community. When Singapore, the reason this got out so around the world, I had to explain that. Discovery Channel did 3 documentaries on my work. And apparently one of the documentaries on suicide survivors went around the world several times, and some countries just didn't have a lot of television, I guess, to watch. So they watched this one a lot. So I started getting calls from Singapore and different countries that were really out there doing the best they could in their communities, running crisis lines, but they didn't have a support group for suicide. But they had a very high suicide rate. And so they were curious about the loss team and how it might help them. So in Singapore, because they didn't have a support group, I went down there for about a week and I did 7 days of training, where some of that time was spent training people to facilitate the support group and build on the model that we had here so they would know how to follow the protocols. And then the other half were training loss team members, which, since they didn't have a support group from which to pull from, people that might be ready that had gotten help, they used their crisis center. And they had over 300 volunteers that manned the staff, the crisis lines in Singapore. And so these folks signed up also to volunteer to go out to the scenes. And Singapore, the average of suicide every day, it's both an island and a country all in one. Gigantic city, millions and millions of people. And most of the suicides are public and they're from high buildings. And so there's also collateral impact that occurs. So when people were going to a crime scene, they didn't know that they would have only the victim who had jumped from the roof to die, or if that victim had also injured other people in the fall. And what we found was that quickly people responded. Now, this is a culture where just to say that you lost a family member to suicide is a great taboo. One young lady who did come to the group and got help several years later wrote a book about both her parents' suicide, but she had to change the name and write it under a pen name with no reference to herself and change a lot of stuff so that people wouldn't know it was her. And her book became very popular in Singapore, and I got a chance to meet her in Australia a few years after she had finished the book, and she gave me a copy. But still to that day, she couldn't be public about the loss and what she was going through. So I know that the stigma and the taboo is worldwide. But what happens is now today, their groups have been going on since I think 2004, and their group members have now started to populate their lost team. So we're finding that people are getting help sooner, getting to a place where they can give back. And by giving back, they're ready. They're not going to become victims of exposure. And so I did a 3-year human subject design study when I started the lost team to see whether or not exposure at the scene might be detrimental to the survivors who had gotten to a place where they were ready to help. They had become altruistic and they had healed from their loss to the point where they were ready to help others. What we found in the 3-year study was we had a comparison sample of 75 individuals who did not go to the scene, but were all suicide survivors that came to the group. Now, that pool of people took the same 3 measures every 60 days, and the team members, which were 12 on the team, took the same measures every 60 days. Now, in research, if you have a small sample like 12 compared to 75, which is considered a much larger sample, you expect there to be less standard deviation in the big sample and more up and downs, if you will, on the measures in the small sample. We found just the opposite to be true. So one assumption is that by going out to the scenes, continuing to meet as a group and do this work and debrief every time and all the protocols that we had put in place, people were actually getting better and dealing with parts of their loss without ever bringing up their loss at the scene. So let me give you an example. We had one man who had lost his father to suicide when he was 17. He didn't get help for 20 years. And he came in and got help, and he was on our lost team. His father had taken his life in a motel. And the first 3 calls he went on were in suicides in motels. And he said that there were times in his life in those 20 years and even in the group where he always wondered what it must have been like for the housekeeper to go in that motel room and find his father. And he always wondered what that must have been like and how much torment that person may have gone through. Well, his first 3 scenes that he went to as a team member were in motels where he got to meet and talk with housekeepers. Now, I don't know what the statistical anomaly is to predict that, but it's enormous because people have to sign up ahead of time for shifts. You don't even know if you'll get a call out. So for him to have had those opportunities was pretty amazing. And we saw that happen over and over again. What I want to share with you, though, is that he said one night in the debrief that even though he might never have talked about the housekeeper in the support group, he said that by doing this work and getting to go to those scenes and meet those individuals and refer them for help, he said, now he's a metaphor guy like me, so hang on. He said it swept out a corner of my grief that I didn't even know needed dusting. That's a kind of poignant example that we saw time and time again. It doesn't mean that by him going out, he was putting his loss in front of the newly bereaved. Not at all. It just means that he excised some of that by helping this person rather than wondering what this person might have been through. And so we found those kinds of examples throughout the 3-year study. And that's what I would say explains that their psychological temperature, if you will, was much lower, and very seldom did it even reach some kind of clinical concern. The times it reached a clinical concern, we checked on that person, we asked them what was going on that day, if they had any recall, and almost always they were sitting on top of an anniversary or some significant event to their loss, and it was temporary and it was no longer an issue. But by doing these random surveys at 60-day frequencies, we were able to do a proper human subject design. Had we had anyone having trouble through exposure, we would have suspended the research and not gone any further. So I'm grateful that we found that exposure to the scene did not create problems, but it did mean that we had to have the right people going to the scene. And so we often in our training explain ways to help make sure people have healed first. You got to heal before you can deal. And to heal, you got to feel, and you got to be in a safe enough place to talk about how you feel. And it's a safe place. And that's what the group and other support systems do. I'm not saying that individual counseling isn't helpful. I would say it could be very important, and I'll talk about some of why that might be true. So in this other area, we were wanting to know, does one relationship come longer? And I doubt that it would be a surprise to everybody. But what you see is that the daughter had the longest number of sessions coming. Now, I would say that's because more men died by suicide, more daughters came in, so you had a higher frequency already. But daughters are going to have lots of milestones throughout the rest of their life, where the absence of a paternal figure is going to come back, and they would return to group quite often as they married, or as they had a child, or they had the loss of their mother. These were times they would return to group for 2 or 3 weeks to kind of get a check-in and check the normalcy of it. And so the mother came in second, and then we see the spouse right after her, then we see sister, and then we see son. So you see, males are going to drop off much quicker, and I don't think it's because they're better. I think they found a way to put a lid on it for now. The men who come the longest are usually the father of a son. And they're struggling to get their life back in control. They've given up almost everything that was a quality of life for them because it was connected to their child. And so since they don't have their child, they don't want to do that activity. And it's only when they start to do those activities that they get closer to the child they've lost. So the paradox, which suicide is full of, is that sometimes you've got to get really close to this grief to heal. But this is a grief that most clinicians don't want to be around. It's too powerful. It's too distraught. It's so honest, so bone honest, that it scares a lot of researchers and a lot of clinicians. But I can tell you right now, if you want to do work that's meaningful, that will change your life, that will make you happy you went to work that day, work with suicide survivors, people that have been impacted by suicide, and learn enough from them to be able to be a resource in the future. Because they will teach you what you need to know if you just use the most powerful intervention skill we have, listening. Whereas my 6th grade teacher used to tell me, now, Frank, you got 2 ears and 1 mouth, and that's a ratio you need to be using. So when I present like this, it really, especially in a virtual world, it looks like I never shut up. But actually in a session, I'm most proud if I say, where do you want to start? And at the end of the session, I say, see you next time. That's a really good session. Now, does any one relationship come for help sooner rather than how long? We're looking at how long the elapsed time is between the death and coming for help. And here's what we found, that the son came in sooner. I'm sorry, later. You see, the higher the bar graph, the longer it is from the time of death. So son was the longest, then daughter, then we had wife, then we have mother, then we have sister, and then mother. So the wife tended to come in quicker than anybody else. And I'm grateful for that, because I can't tell you, in our society, spouses, female spouses, are held accountable for the death. Not only do they hold themselves accountable, but our society says things to them at the funeral home like, what did you miss? What could you have done better? It's like a critique on this person being responsible for this life that she'd probably done everything in the world. I had one wife tell me if I'd have tied him to me with rope, he'd have found a way to hang himself in the rope. But yet everybody blames me no matter how much I did to try and keep him alive. Husbands who lose their wives are given sympathy and an extra casserole. And they come and they show up and they say, oh, you did everything. You held down a good job. You did this, all this stereotype stuff that has no real valid place at a funeral home. People are very cruel at funeral homes. And the joke in the weekly group that went around on a regular basis is somebody would come in and say something someone said to them. And it was known as stupid things people say. Now, I have to pay $1 fine in front of my grandchildren anytime I say stupid about somebody. But in this case, in that group, nobody paid any fines because I have to say that's about the most descriptive word I have for the things people say. They were saying things like, well, I'll pray for your child because I know they're burning in hell. Now, they've said this around the world. So it may just be a few stupid people out there, but let me tell you, they get around. And they have more frequent flyer miles than my luggage. And this is what's so tragic about the inappropriate comments. And we need to have a suicide-safe vocabulary. We need to find the words that are helpful. So I've started doing a workshop called just that. Do you have a suicide-safer vocabulary for clinicians? Here's a tip. Don't say commit. Commit is an antiquated, outdated term. It goes back to the Dark Ages where the body was punished and the family was punished. And a person went from village to village investigating suspicious deaths, and they were known as a crowner because they were there on behalf of the crown, because their suicide prevention model was that if you kill yourself and we discover that it was a suicide, we then have the right by the crown, because you're a chattel, to rape, pillage, and plunder your family, because you would only do that if they had been cruel and mean to you. So therefore, we will take punishment on your behalf. What a ridiculous suicide prevention approach. So you could see why early on people would keep suicide a secret. You know, if grandma took her life, grandma may fall down the stairs too, to try and make that look like an accident. This crowner was a hideous person who I'm sure took bribes and everything else. Well, in America, that's where we get the term coroner from. It's from the crowner. The crowner investigated suspicious death and decided the manner of death. That's a legal process in England. Here it's more of a medical or forensic process, a justice process. So the coroner here has the same responsibility, investigate the manner of death. And I can tell you, it's one of the hardest boxes on a death certificate for a coroner to have to check is manner of death, suicide. And yet, that is the job. And without a lot of forensic evidence, it should never be checked. But it is possible that many, many suicides go reported as undetermined, accidental, or even homicide. I'm just here to say, it's not a perfect art. Without forensic evidence, and people on a regular basis, I run into coroners that say, well, I can't call it a suicide because I don't have a suicide note. Suicide notes are rare. They're left about 15% of the time in most of the research I've read. And they're all very ambiguous. But there have been families that have come into my office that knew it was a suicide because they found the note, but they didn't find it until months after the death. And they never turned it over to the authorities because they had gotten an undetermined cause of death and they wanted to keep it that way. They were able to say, I don't know how it happened. But the suicide note described exactly what they would do. And most often this is a single car accident where they drive into a bridge or a tree or something and they describe it in their suicide note. But we found about 15% of the people that came in with a non-declared suicide manner of death had knowledge that it was a suicide. But you see how that stigma causes that silence. So for them to even say, I'm going to a suicide survivor support group, would let the cat out of the bag, so to speak. So we find that individuals have to keep lots of secrets when it's been a suicide. And they only really get their grief, they get free of that kind of hidden grief when they find the safe place to be able to describe the other issues going on in their loved one's life. Suicide seldom happens in a world where everything's going perfect. And so to be able to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly in a place where people don't judge you for it is a real gift. And that's what most survivor groups do, in my opinion. Now, does any one relationship come in sooner if you go out with APM? So you see the difference now? We're seeing that with APM over here, instead of thousands of days, we got, the highest is 90 days instead of years. So that's the difference. The top 5 relationships out of 433 were the same ones: mother, sister, wife, daughter, son. And these are intakes that occur when the death occurred after 1999. So it's after we had the one whole year of doing APM. And now what I found is that if you do APM in your community, the word gets out. And even if you don't have a chance to go to the scene, somebody finds that family and tells them about the resource. It may be another survivor who was in the group 20 years before, but survivors are more motivated to go and just reach out to a neighbor and say, look, when this happened to me, I went here for help, and I think you at least ought to know about it. So we're finding that with Google and all the other internet resources, people can find help as long as it's properly populated out in the internet as for what it means. When the name of the group is somewhat disguised or made to look less shocking, by that I mean they don't use the word suicide, people have a hard time finding that. I personally would advocate that we should publish in every major city, every county, every parish. We have parishes here. Who died by what cause of death or manner of death every month. And they should all be reported exactly the same. There are 5 causes of death. There's no reason to hide a cause of death. We've been doing this with COVID all year. What night have you not turned on the news and seen the deaths in the country and in the world? We are finally making some headway on the idea that people would benefit from knowing what's out there in reality. So I'm hoping that might translate in a post-COVID world to a fact that we start to talk more clearly about death, because that is the one thing we all share in common, is that we will die. So I think it's about time we get out of that denial of death that Becker wrote about and won the Pulitzer Prize for. Now, here's why I think a mental health person should be involved in seeing the individual before they go to group. About 17% found or discovered the body, which means they were heavily exposed to physical trauma, emotional trauma, and sensory exposure. And that trifecta will give them traumatic response. Trauma and grief are separate psychological constructs, and they should not be confused. Grief is a normal process for the loss of someone you love. Trauma is not. It's an abnormal reality. And it's usually from being psychologically vulnerable. You weren't prepared for it. You didn't brace for it the way an EMT does on the way to a wreck or an ambulance scene. And you were emotionally connected to the person and you were exposed. Those 3 things can lead to a lot of trauma and a lot of exposure. This is why I think law enforcement are heavily traumatized, military, really anybody in our country that wears a uniform for any level of service is overexposed to trauma. So those are the things that I wanted to talk about this morning. I think I'm on my cue time-wise, and I think now that Sharon, you've been monitoring, or Chris has, somebody's been monitoring the questions. I'd like to, I guess, go to that so that I stay on my time limit. It would have been a 30-minute talk had it been delivered by someone not from the South.
Dr. Campbell, we have a question. What does APM stand for?
Active postvention model. It's right there in the title
Thank you.
on the slide.
Mhm.
I named it that in order to compare it to a passive model, where so what it means is that your community is active in reaching out to the newly bereaved. And I think we all agree that that makes sense. Schneidman said that postvention is the most important aspect of the entire model of prevention, intervention, and postvention. Those kindly acts that need to be done for those who are bereaved. 30% to 40% of those who come in for help report thoughts of suicide, having never had those thoughts for themselves prior to their exposure to loss. So we're working with a high-risk population. And as I've said before, and not meaning to be sarcastic, we can find survivors. They're standing next to the body. But trying to find people at risk is really hard to do, because they might not be at risk in the morning and be at risk in the afternoon. They might not be at risk today. They might be a year from now. It might have been 10 years ago and they won't be in the future. At risk is much harder, but survivors are at risk and we can find them. So by reducing their future risk to die by suicide, we are doing postvention, which becomes prevention. And that's what active postvention does. It reduces suicide.
If participants have any questions for Dr. Campbell, please type them in the Q&A chat box, and I'll be pulling them from there to ask Dr. Campbell. So question for you. What would you suggest is a good starting point for a community that wants to start a postvention model?
Well, first of all, make sure you have services for survivors. Make sure there's support groups in your community, and do some exit interviews with survivors. Ask them if it's helping them. Support groups in our country are like snowflakes. And I know in Pennsylvania, you guys get a lot of snow up there, but you know, every snowflake's unique. So every group is unique. Some meet once a month, some meet every other week, some meet every week. Some are educational, what they call psychoeducational. Some are grief groups. Some are peer-led, some are peer and professional-led. Some have screenings, some don't. So finding out what you have in your community, what resources, because you don't need a loss team, because if you don't, why would you build a lighthouse on a rocky shore and not have a place to point towards safe harbor? You've got to have the safe harbor first, or you have nothing to point to, like Singapore.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have another question here. Can you talk more about research about how survivors are doing after the sessions end? I guess after the participation and the support groups is done and they've graduated.
Once people decide to leave the group, we ask them to say goodbye to the group, because they never got a chance to say goodbye to their loved one for the most part. So in that process, they will often talk about where they would like to see themselves in the future. Now, I did the first long-term survivor retreat last November, and it's the first one we know of in the world. And we had 21 people come in for 3 days, and we learned a great deal about people that were 10 or more years out. So we're still writing that one up. We had an embedded psychologist in each group of 7, and we've got quantitative and qualitative information from it. But the short piece of that observation is, regardless of how healed a person thinks they are when they leave the group, the grief still has remnants that will be with them the rest of their life. Because we had people 30 years out that still were surprised how much their grief came back. Now, here's the difference. The grief doesn't come back as pain, it comes back as love, because that's what grief is. And so move into that place where your expression of your grief evokes tears is not a clinical concern. It's actually quite often joy that the person can still be with their loved one in that safe place. And this is what's been detrimental in since the 1900s, trying to shorten the grief process. We moved away from allowing people to have a year or more, wear black, cover their mirrors, put a black wreath on the front door, and actually be public about the fact that they're grieving, to shorten it to the National Grief Policy. And Chris, I bet you know the National Grief Policy. You get 3 days off if it's in town, 4 if it's out of town. And plus you got to prove to us who you are related to that died. You know who won't be on that list? Your best friend. So what we've got is a culture through the Industrial Revolution that said, this model is not efficient. We can't allow you to have a year to grieve your loved one. We need this done in 3 or 4 days. And I would say today they want it even quicker. So we have microwaved grief. And I don't know about you, I could eat a microwave potato, but it is sure not the same as that one that comes out of the oven. So I think if we want to be fully baked,
Give Dr. Campbell a second to see if he comes back on here. Looks like we're having some technical difficulty.
I'm going to hop in here and mention that we do have a number of questions coming in on the chat. And just to reiterate that if we can't get to all of them, we will be sending something out responding to questions. The other thing that I think we can do right now, given that he's having some bandwidth issues, there are storms coming into Louisiana right now. So that's one of the things we've been dealing with this morning. I think we can take our break, and then if we'll maybe take one more question from him when we return. How would that be?
Sounds good.
All right. So about the break, we will have a timer running during this break. And I strongly encourage leg stretching, get up, walk around, run around, get a cup of coffee, and join us back here. The break is 15 minutes. Am I correct on that? And, we'll be right back. So just watch your screen for the timer, and we'll see you in 15 minutes.
Okay. We're back from our break. We were able to catch up with Dr. Campbell on his cell phone. How you doing, Dr. Campbell?
I'm doing better. I don't know what's going on. We're lost all access to the internet. So we've had some problems ever since Hurricane Sally came through, and it looks like they're working on the Wi-Fi again. And unfortunately, they didn't check with me first. So
no worries. We have some questions that have come through during the break that we can field now. First question:
okay.
What constitutes effective APM? And adversely, what are we looking to avoid? What's a poor APM?
All right, so APM, active postvention, could be something as simple as a person going and just reaching out to a neighbor when they've had a suicide and saying, when I had a suicide, I went to this place, you might want to consider going there. Active means we go to the survivor. Passive means they have to find the resources. So that's a big difference. Anytime you turn that paradigm around to where they're not having to be the one seeking help. Look, they're the most injured person. This would be the equivalent of somebody being in a car wreck, being in terrible physical shape, and saying, well, good luck getting to the hospital. We're going to send an ambulance out there, and we're going to get them to medical treatment. And so we're talking about communities being the ambulance to people. So anything that makes that happen would be active postvention. My belief is it's a lot safer to do it under some protocols and under the auspices of a for-profit or a nonprofit that can support them so that it's sustainable. 2 or 3 people trying to do this on their own, never going to happen. We tried that for 20 years. It took me 10 years to get to the first scene. So I would tell you to try to work with the Suicide Prevention Committee in your area to access first responders and talk to them about making this possible. It's not a new idea anymore. And my Lost Team website has a lot of information on it and a free listserv where you can sign up for it. And it's just lossteam.com. So go there and you can find out a lot more about active postvention. But look at everything on the website. Don't just go to the home page. Read every little page. It's got a lot of information.
Thank you for that. Another question. How do you prepare Lost Team members for work on the scene? And specifically, I would like to add to that a little bit. How do you work and train those Lost Team members to avoid seeing certain things on the scene? Because I would assume that's important.
Well, certainly every locale has to decide what they will and won't be exposing survivors to. I wish that was a short answer to that. I can tell you that I spend 2 days training communities when I teach it, and there are associates on my website that teach this in other parts of the country, but they're willing to travel, and they're younger and better looking than I am. So you've got a lot of people you could talk to that have been doing this. Govan Martin in your state has brought me there several times when he was director of Prevent Suicide Pennsylvania. And, I've done trainings in at least 4 cities in Pennsylvania, lost team 2-day trainings. And in that environment, first you've got to find the stakeholders. And I would say most communities benefit from taking a year or more to get this plan on the runway and then have a long enough runway to take off. You've got to have the police, the mayor, the law enforcement. You've got to have whoever the Suicide Prevention Committee can bring. Fresno is the only county in the United States where several $1 million was appointed for 5 years of lost team work. And this is starting to happen in different places. So if funding is required, then I would say that that's a good beginning point. But first, you got to organize people that are getting help already, that are at a place where they want to help others, and they are interested in doing this to go out and be the installation of hope. The average length of time at a scene right now is about 45 minutes. You're really just there to make that referral and leave. You're not there to do counseling. That would be inappropriate. That's why peers matter at the scene, because a member of our team saying, well, I just wanted to tell the father because when my son took his life, I didn't have any help. And then his daughter grabbed that man on our team and said, you lost your son? And he said, yes, I did. And that's why I'm here. She said, come on, you got to talk to my dad, and drug him into the place where her father was. But up until then, the family didn't want anybody talking to him. They're not going to, because first responders have been there at the scene for quite a while, and they want fewer people, not more people. So your first responders are the ones that open the doorway for you to be able to be at the scene and be legitimate. So that's my recommendation. There's a lot more to unpacking that than I could do right now on the phone call. But, go to my website. You'll read a lot. You'll learn a lot. And it's not a franchise. You could, anytime you go out and help a survivor, you're doing active post-vention.
Thank you for that answer. Okay, we have a question regarding first responders. Would you consider first responders responding to the scene of a suicide or an attempted suicide a part of the survivor category? And within your research, has there been any post-vention models for first responders that you would suggest?
Well, absolutely. That was my point of saying that anyone in our community, in our country that wears a uniform is overexposed to trauma. And so we do work with law enforcement and first responders of all types. I'm doing some training right now in my state in 10 different regions to help first responders recognize the warning signs of exposure to trauma in their own life so that they might get help. I have a 4-hour workshop called Coping with a Crisis. And during COVID, this has been a very popular workshop because first responders can really relate to the effects of crisis and not coping well. So I think we're in an opportunity state, just as Diane mentioned at the beginning, because more people now know what it means to be that person that feels all alone. Too many people, 210,000 plus, have died alone in a facility where family had to stand in a parking lot and wave at the window. It's just, we've gone through a place where people now understand what disenfranchised grief looks like.
Sure. Thank you for that answer. Another question here. So some people think of suicidal thoughts as a mental illness, but is it possible that considering suicide is a reaction to trauma and not long-term mental health issues?
Well, yeah, first of all, I don't agree that it's a mental health problem because I think we'd be better served if we talk about thoughts of suicide as maladaptive coping. It's maladaptive in that having those thoughts won't help you feel better. But there are people that one of the ways they cope with the stress in their life, people that are in abusive situations, people that are in combat, there are people that cope with that stress by using maladaptive thinking, like I could always kill myself to escape this pain. And that's actually what gets them through day by day. So I think we're better served if we think of coping as not good or bad, but adaptive or maladaptive. And people use alcohol, they use drugs, they use lots of things that are maladaptive because it doesn't reduce your stress, it increases it. And it lowers your ability to cope. You're more fragile if you're using thoughts of suicide cope than you are if you're using thoughts about safety and life. So I don't see it as a mental illness, I see it as a coping. And when people ask me, why do people kill themselves? The answer I would give that has fit most of the thousands of scenes I've been involved in was a failure to cope with a self-defined crisis. And if we help people learn how to cope in life, period, we will elevate their ability to cope when a crisis hits that could lead them into suicidal thought. And I want to avoid saying suicidal. I want to say suicide, thoughts of suicide. And see, I like to conjugate the word to suicide this way. I'd say suicided, meaning they died, or suiciding, meaning they're having either thoughts or behavior about dying. And so suicidal to me doesn't describe where they are on that continuum from thoughts of suicide to behavior. Thoughts don't kill you. Behavior kills you. So I hope that makes a little bit more sense. These are those wonderful opportunities to talk honestly about suicide that we would all benefit from. My best friend killed himself when he was 12. We did not talk about his death. And to this day, all these years later, my friends that are still alive that were in that 6th grade class with me still get together somewhere in a reunion, and we all go back to that day. And the few of us that have survived this long, they still look at me and go, well, what do you think happened? And I don't have any more information today than I did when I was 12. But what I do know is we didn't talk about it. And postvention says we talk about it. That's what postvention is about, communication, describing thoughts and feelings. So sorry, I got on my soapbox around.
No, that was a great answer. Thank you, Dr. Campbell. We have another one
Sure.
in
Just
regards.
call me Frank, Chris. Now, you know my rule. Call me Frank.
Oh, right, Frank. Can you talk a little bit about postvention and supporting educational settings, adolescents ages like 12 to 15 and even high schools? Here in Bucks County, when we lose a young person in our high schools, it really impacts the community significantly.
Well, yeah, that question is a great follow-up to what I said a minute ago. My first exposure that I was aware of was my best friend killing himself at 12. And when I became involved in going to schools, that was definitely part of my motivation. And I would have principals who would say, well, we had a student kill himself, but we're not going to talk about that today. This was back in the 80s. And we were pioneering children's bereavement here at the time. And, kids were coming in with lots of information about suicide and the death of their family member, but everybody thought they didn't know anything because if you're shorter than the people around you, they think you can't hear them or something. So kids had more details about suicides than often do. But with today's media, you're not going to keep kids from finding out about a suicide of a youth. We're better off giving them what we do know so that they don't create the rumors that get created and people get scapegoated and everything else. Any death that occurs to staff, faculty, or student should have postvention opportunity, in my opinion, because early on, my research showed that if you have a sudden death of a student or a faculty or a staff member, it will precede then students thinking about suicide because they get gravitationally or temporally pulled into that emotional world. So talking about that grief, the kids that are at risk of suicide pop up like toast. And so that's what we found in our community. And now today we have a whole millage dedicated to postvention in the schools where trained counselors go in and do groups with the kids and they identify kids having trouble with mental health issues, and we get them the help they need. So school is a great environment to be able to tease out, if you will, those kids that are having other crises going on in their life, and they're not coping well with it.
Thank you for that answer, Frank. Another question here, getting down to the last couple. So could you tease out, and what are your thoughts on the similarities and differences between a sudden loss, like many Americans are experiencing right now with COVID, and that of a loss of a suicide?
Well, there are a few losses more sudden than suicide, because it comes often, even though if there's been attempts in the past, it creates a false negative, and people believe they won't ever die. So when they do die, it's still that reality of suddenness. Other than active shooters, which almost begin and end with suicide in 80+% of all the cases we've had since Columbine. What I believe is this: with a COVID death, for the most part, you're going to have some awareness of the illness, and then you're going to have some anxiety that death could be the outcome. So it's not as sudden, just like cancer, etc. But the uncertainty is always there. With suicide, the focus tends to shift from the deceased to all the other people in their life, in an attempt to either take on guilt or apply guilt to other people, as opposed to applying the responsibility to the deceased. So it is a much more complex and complicated bereavement, and it has an unknown pattern of loss, because with COVID, you can at least say this is due to an infection. It's a disease. And so like a car accident, which is sudden, there's still an explanatory thing for you to do. And with Americans, we like 1 + 1 = 2. Suicide is an irrational cause of death that doesn't have a 1 + 1 formula. Suicide is full of paradoxes where a person both wants to live and wants to die. And we don't deal with opposites being true. That is what I find with our culture, that we are not comfortable with the fact that a person could want to live and simultaneously want to die. If that's stinking thinking, and you should just switch it off in your mind. But if we accept that it's a coping behavior, we're much more understanding of people having maladaptive coping. So we've got to do a paradigm shift where we begin to recognize that suicide becomes an answer to end the pain, but it is definitely, and I don't like the long-term solution to a short-term problem. That's bull, because if you find out you have a mental health problem, that's not short-term. If your loved one dies, that's not short-term. If you lose limbs, if you've been exposed to Trump, those aren't short-term things. So it's a glib answer that Phil Donahue issued on TV years ago that people still keep discovering and thinking, oh, that's a great way to tell somebody not to kill themselves. That is not the solution. The solution is listen to why they want to die. The dying side needs to be understood, and the living side wants help. And if we use that formula, it works. We've helped thousands of people that call in the crisis line wanting to die. And by allowing them to talk, listening to them, and not giving glib reassurance, they figure out the solution for them, even if it's to live just one more day, because you just keep putting those days together.
Thank you for that answer. One last question here. If anybody else has questions, please type them into the Q&A section at the bottom, and we can ask Dr. Campbell. So Frank, if there was one last thing that you would want to leave us with in regards to your loss model, especially in regards to getting it started, what would that be? I understand that having effective support groups is really important, but when you're determining who is ready to participate on a loss team, what are we looking for in regards to that individual's recovery?
Well, one thing is that they're able to talk about their loss in a safe messaging fashion. They talk about their loss in a way that says that the grief that they have experienced in the past is not the grief they're experiencing today. And they are ready, willing, and able to go to a scene where somebody has just discovered their loved one, somebody is feeling all alone, and be there to support them and point them toward help. And they can't know this, of course, until they do it. But most people who begin to contemplate this idea have some at first interest, secondly, desire, and then third, willingness to get trained and an appreciation that if they go to a scene and they realize it's not right for them, they say, let me help in some other way. Let me make coffee for the team. Let me set up chairs for group. They can find a whole list of ways to volunteer and be involved. But the idea of somebody volunteering their time and walking up to your door to knock on it to say, I'm just here to point you toward help, that is an amazing thing. And it pays tremendous dividends. At the scene, they will not have determined it to be a suicide, but many times the family members will tell you, I know it was a suicide. You're out there because it's a sudden and traumatic loss. And so the teams that go out are there strictly to say, when I had my loss, it was sudden and traumatic like yours. This is where I went for help. And I'm going to leave some brochures here for you. Call this number. It's important to remember that you go to the scene to refer, not to become the referral. Think of the lighthouse. The lighthouse stands on the rocky shore and it points towards safe harbor. It does not wade out into the water to grab the person who's in danger. That's not the approach. So if people have a sense of, I want to rescue people, that's probably a warning sign right there. They've got to be open to listening more than they talk and supporting rather than helping that person individually. They're there to point toward help. And that is what a lost team member does.
Great.
And they're local.
Thanks, Frank.
You bet.
We have a question about what is the name of the Singapore survivor that authored the book that you referred to earlier?
I don't have that name handy. I can't even find the book. I've moved 3 times since I got it. And every time I've ever loaned a book to somebody, it doesn't seem to come back.
Okay.
So I was actually just this morning thinking about that book. But on my website, I believe the link to the Singapore team is still there. Oh, I just got to join. It looks like I'm going to be able to join the call again. I don't know. But all of a sudden, the website opened up.
Oh, look at that. There you are.
There we go.
I apologize, everybody. I don't know what's going on with the Wi-Fi, but Bill Gates probably heard that I was speaking negatively and cut off my power. I don't know. I know a lot of people think he's a nice guy. He messes with me all the time.
Well, it's good to have you back on. And
I'm glad to be here.
Great,
I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of the day.
Great. One last question here. What would you say is most important in addressing an individual's survivor guilt?
Well, first of all, I reframe guilt. Guilt to me is something that we do because we mean to do harm. And that's why we punish ourselves or our society punishes us for it. I find that most people, when they describe the thing they claim to be guilty of, it sounds a lot more like regret. They regret they didn't answer the phone that night. They regret they didn't call that person. It's very different than meaning to do harm. And so the fact that they took one night off for themselves and the person took their life could easily be adopted as guilt, but it sounds like regret to me. So when I find people are able to even measure out how much of the guilt is theirs and how much belongs to their loved one, that's a beginning point. But I've seen moms take 99.9% of the guilt in the beginning and then over time begin to give up some percentages of that to their child or their loved one. And so I'm always looking to reframe guilt. I don't see guilt as a feeling, although a lot of people do. I see it as a thought. And as a result, it's stinking thinking.
Yeah.
Most people, they ascribe something to me that I wouldn't call guilt.
Thank you for that. So we're out of questions. Again, thank you, Frank, for sharing your model with us. A great great presentation. I'm going to hand it off to Sharon now. I think we'll be taking a short break, but go ahead, Sharon.
Hi, everyone. So thank you very much, Dr. Campbell. And one of the comments that came in is, what a wonderful presenter. So I want to share that with you. And I know
Was
that
it,
there are...
Was it when I went off the screen?
No, no. But it's so nice to have you here with us. And I think we will be talking more in the future. We're going to take a 5-minute break. So this is a quick one. Just stretch your legs and then we're on to our next presenters. All right, our break is winding down and I highly recommend dancing to the music during the breaks. It gets you re-energized. Reminder that type in questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can. That I know that there have been a few questions again about continuing education credits. Just at the end of the day, there will be a Survey Monkey pop-up. You answer the questions in that, and the last question will give you a link to your certificate that you can print out. So without further ado, our next presentation is regarding resiliency during times of loss and distress. Our presenter is Kara Sharp, a therapist at Lenape Valley Foundation. I'm thrilled to have her present this morning. Kara is one of our therapists who specializes in DBT skills, for those of you that are familiar with that type of treatment. And I had a sneak preview of the presentation. I think that you will enjoy it. It has a lot of really good information for a variety of situations, but especially regarding trauma and loss. So welcome, Kara.
Thank you so much, Sharon. The presentation today on fostering resiliency during times of distress and loss is geared towards the past 7 months that we've all been experiencing, and how to move forward in a stronger, more capable way in which we can build on our current strengths, increase our coping abilities, and come out stronger on the other side. So we've all been a part of a very unusual and difficult time. We've experienced drastic changes in our lives, a variety of limitations, separation from family and friends for some of us, and just a general question mark of what life will look like in the months to come. And at the same time, we have also seen so much strength and support and resiliency around us, even if that support is virtual these days. So this serves as a reminder that we are able to do hard things, that we can build on our current capabilities and our current strengths and truly cope well. So let's first talk about what resilience is, right? It's the ability to mentally or emotionally cope with a crisis or to return to a pre-crisis state quickly. So basically, this means that we learn to think and behave in ways that increase our strengths and coping abilities, and at the same time, we protect ourselves from the negative effects of stress. So this could look very different, and it could show up in a variety of ways. We could be calm or calmer during a crisis. Sometimes resilience means just not making things worse than what they already are. Sometimes it's behaving in ways that align with our values and priorities, so we are bettering ourselves for the long term instead of trying to just eliminate the pain in the short term. So we need resilience in a crisis. We need a resilience in very difficult situations. And we could say that we are all living in a state of crisis and have been for some time. It is highly stressful. A crisis has a very high potential for a negative outcome. It may not have an immediate solution. And at the same time, we have this intense desire to solve this crisis immediately. So with this intense desire and this the need for an immediate solution, it creates intense emotions. We feel desperate. We feel out of control. Sometimes those emotional urges cause us to act in ways to resolve the crisis, but it creates more problems for us because they are emotional urges. They are impulsive behaviors. So this will be about learning crisis survival skills. So we cope well with the crisis, we don't make anything worse, and we build our resilience for the future. So when do we need crisis survival skills? We need them when there is intense emotional pain that cannot be helped quickly. We need them when acting will only make things worse. When our needs must be met even if we're feeling overwhelmed. Sometimes we become paralyzed. Sometimes we become overwhelmed and we truly cannot think of what to do next. We call that a skills breakdown point. As our emotional intensity goes up, our cognitive processing goes down. And that's a real thing. So we learn how to cope with the crisis to return to some level of baseline. So we can think about, what do I want to do next? What choices do I have? And what choice is going to be best for me here? We call these in DBT distress tolerance skills. And most of the distress tolerance skills are geared towards coping with a crisis while also accepting our reality, even if we can't stand it. And we will get to that as well. So one of the first skills that we teach in terms of coping with a crisis is called self-soothing. And this is about doing things that feel pleasant to us or comforting to provide the relief from the stress and the pain. It's treating ourselves kindly, kind of like we would treat a friend or a loved one. And the way that we remember this is we incorporate our 5 senses. So we can do self-soothing anywhere. We can do it if we are home, if we are out in public, if we are at work, if we are in a crowd of people. Vision, hearing, smell, taste, touch. We can evoke a comforted physiological response by using our senses in any moment that we are in. We have some ideas here, looking at the stars or going to the park and looking at nature, listening to music or nature sounds if you find that soothing, baking cookies, bread, essential oils, lighting a candle, eating something you like, or even just sucking on a hard candy, wrapping up in a comfortable blanket, petting your dog or cat, maybe putting on lotion. Whatever you can do in that moment that feels soothing and comforting is a way to provide some distance from that pain and that suffering and treat ourselves well. The next skill we teach is distraction. And we use the acronym ACCEPTS to remember our options here. And the reason that we include distraction is because sometimes we need distance from whatever set off the pain in the first place, or we need a break to think about, what can I do here to cope? So again, we have some ideas, and distraction we suggest is temporary because distraction can very quickly lead to avoidance if we use it too much. We can distract and we never get to problem solving. So nothing ends up changing or improving. So when we use distraction, we're very strategic in how we use it. We make sure we set a time limit for ourselves, usually no longer than a day. And we choose from a variety of options. We can distract with activities. So exercising or watching a movie, cleaning your house, going for a drive, whatever takes up space in your mind. So you have that distance from that painful experience. Contributing. We know that sometimes taking the focus off of ourselves and putting it on another person feels helpful, feels good, feels meaningful. So that could be as simple as reaching out to a friend, helping someone else, or contributing to our general community. Comparisons can be helpful. And by that, I mean remembering a time when we felt differently, as a reminder to ourselves that this is temporary, that the way we feel right this second will pass. Because there was a time before when we did not feel this way, which tells us there is a time in the future where we will also not feel this way. We can distract with our emotions. We can purposefully do things that elicit different emotions. So stand-up comedy is very popular in our DBT groups. That is our go-to favorite strategy to change an emotion. There's some that love thrillers and psychological books and mystery novels. Love it. And it's very effective in changing our emotion and distracting for a short period of time. We could also read or listen to something uplifting, shift our perspective, which helps shift our emotions. There's also pushing away when we truly cannot sit with the discomfort anymore. We can use a thought-stopping technique to drastically shift our thoughts. We can physically write our thoughts down and put them in another space to actually push away and create that concrete distance. We could also distract our thoughts with something very thought-provoking, like doing a puzzle, doing a crossword. Another favorite strategy in our program is starting at 100 and counting down by 7. It's very difficult. It takes a lot of energy in your mind, and it distracts your thoughts, for sure. So it does the job. You can also distract with sensations. We have an ice water skill that I'll be talking about later in the presentation. But anything in the moment that creates a new sensation for you, a hot shower, a cold shower, even holding an ice cube or rubbing an ice cube on the back of your neck. Crisis survival is about not making things worse. It may not immediately help you feel better in this moment. We will get to the things that can do that. But what we focus on right after a crisis is let's sit with it, let's survive it well, and let's not make anything worse off. So as I said, we balance acceptance and change in DBT. So when we spend so much energy not accepting our current circumstances and our current reality, we don't have much energy left for coping. We become exhausted. We become stuck and discouraged. So these two skills that I'm going to introduce to you here are accepting our reality with our body. We do it all the way. We incorporate our posture, our facial expressions, the way that we hold our hands. And I'm actually going to demonstrate and ask you if you would like to participate in these two skills. And the good news is that everybody is behind a screen, so you don't have to worry about what your face looks like when you're trying to practice the half smile. But it is simply relaxing your face from the top of your head all the way down. It's consciously smoothing it out and letting go of the tension. And letting both corners of your lips go slightly up, just so you can feel them, not necessarily so another person can see you smile. This is not a true smile, it's a half smile. And we are adopting a serene expression. So let's take a minute, and I invite you to participate if you would like, and do your best to adopt a half smile position. And you can close your eyes if you like. That's something that I do as well. Notice any difference in how you feel in this moment. Are you able to accept this current moment? And this is another skill that you can do anywhere. It's not very noticeable, and it's also extremely effective. It's a way to practice willingness by basically saying and showing our bodies, I can accept this. I can be open to this moment. I can be receptive. I don't have to fight it. The next skill that goes along with that is willing hands. So if you are in a space in which you don't feel comfortable doing the half smile, we suggest willing hands, which is another open, receptive position with your body, basically saying, I'm willing to accept this. It is simply placing your hands on your lap with your hands up, palms outward, fingers relaxed. And if you notice when we are anxious or tense or frustrated or in distress, we clench up, we tense up. We may not even notice it. Our shoulders may be tight. We may be clenching our teeth. We may be clenching our fists or folding our arms, which reinforces that feeling and that thought of, I can't do this. I can't handle this. I'm totally resisting what I'm encountering. So our emotions follow suit. Our emotions say, yeah, we can't do it. And that creates more suffering for us. With half smiling and willing hands, we are saying, we can do it, or at least we can accept it if we can't do it. And our emotions have nothing to fight against. So you will see the physiological change within yourself. We practice this a lot with our clients, and we ask them to imagine a scenario in which they felt very angry. Anger, as I'm sure you all know, you become very tense and very closed off. And when you're imagining an encounter in which you felt angry, but every part of your body is open, serene, and accepting, you can physically feel your anger go down. There is no longer a space for it. It's no longer needed. So this is how we teach acceptance with our body. And radical acceptance, if anyone has been in DBT before or encountered DBT, radical acceptance is huge. We teach that to everyone, and we make sure to stress that pain is part of life. And even though every life has a margin of pain in it, it is still worth living. And it is the non-acceptance of that pain that creates the suffering. Because we can all manage ordinary pain. We actually joke and say, if in DBT, if any life does not have problems, that's a disaster, because how else would you practice skills? We need the pain, we need the problems to become effective and skillful and resilient. We don't need the suffering. Those are two very different things. So when we spend our energy resisting the pain, saying it shouldn't be, yelling, stomping our feet, this is not fair. I refuse to do this. I refuse to move. This is not happening. That is what creates the suffering. We can choose a different response. We can say, I accept it and I don't like it. And with that acceptance, with that radical acceptance of the thoughts, our words, our body posture, it frees up our emotional energy to think about, can I do anything? Or what can I do next? What do I want to do next? We are not exhausted. We have options, and we are free to see those options. So pain becomes the suffering when we fight the reality. And acceptance is not agreement. Acceptance is not letting someone or something off the hook. Acceptance is not giving up. And acceptance is not agreeing with or condoning behavior that is harmful or that we don't agree with. It is simply acknowledgement. And it is saying, this moment should be exactly how it is, given what has happened before, even if we can't stand it. There is no other way for this moment to be. And it is in true acceptance where significant change can then happen. Because we are now emotionally free. We are no longer fighting and resisting and exhausted. Which brings me to the section of the presentation that we will talk about how we increase our resilience. So we've survived a crisis, we've survived it well, and now we want to build ourselves up. We want to cope with these difficult situations, we want to cope with it well, and we want to increase our positive emotions while we're at it. Because all pain and no relief is not sustainable. So we know that it's much easier to deal with loss. It's much easier to deal with distress when we can balance it out with some relief and even a positive emotion or pleasure. So we call this reducing emotional vulnerability. We know that we are all more prone to negative emotions or intense emotions when a few things are going on. First, when we are under physical or environmental stress. I'm sure we can all relate that if we are sick, if we are sleep deprived, if we have not eaten well, we are not that great at regulating our emotions, right? We are much more irritable or quick to react. We are more vulnerable to that reactivity. Or environmental stress. If we are homeless, if we are living in a situation and when there's conflict all the time, or our basic needs are not being met, we are much more vulnerable to intense emotion and skills breakdown. Sometimes we are in situations in which we cannot control, which leads again to that desperate state of emotional reactivity where we're just kind of reacting and we're not choosing our reactions. We're just impulsive and emotional. Or if we're living in a state of deprivation, sometimes thinking about regulating emotions seems like a luxury. When we don't have a home, if we don't have food, or we don't have relationships. So we call this building a life worth living. Increasing our resilience involves these 4 steps here. And ultimately, every single life is worth living. There's no life that's not. But the point of this statement is that we want everybody to experience their life as worth living. We want people to think that their lives are meaningful and purposeful. Even though every life is, not everybody experiences their life as that. So this is about getting to the place where you can feel good and content with the life that you have and the life that you have made. So we do this in 4 ways. We talk about how do we increase our positive emotions in the short term and the long term. Because like I said before, it's much easier to cope with distress and loss if we have some positive emotions in our lives at some point to balance that out. We talk about building a sense of mastery. So building our sense of accomplishment, our sense of competence, that thought of, I can do this, I've done this before, so I can deal with hard things again. We talk about coping ahead with difficult situations. So we prepare a plan and we rehearse a plan for the situations that tend to get us in trouble, or the situations that we tend to encounter in which we struggle in coping. So we prep. So when we get to that point, we are ready and we are skillful. And we also talk about building a resilient biology. It's hard to take care of your mind when we are not taking care of our body. The mind-body connection is so strong. So we talk about all of the things that we can do to build a physical resilience. So let's start with the accumulating positive emotions in the short term. So this is about doing pleasant things that are possible right now. And at the end of this presentation, I have a ton of ideas if you're looking for them, and they are all COVID friendly, so we could do them at any point. So we want to feel good right now, even if those positive emotions are fleeting or maybe temporary and don't last that long. Building on those experiences make a difference. We know that pleasant events also decrease discomfort. So not only do they increase our positive emotions, but we also don't feel as uncomfortable. They are possible even in deprivation. We've had many clients say, there's not much I can do. But if we think about it and we brainstorm and we problem solve, we always end up coming up with some really great ideas that are very manageable, very doable right now. And it's worth the effort. I understand that it is hard to engage in a pleasant event, especially when we are feeling so distressed, so lost in general. It is worth the effort. And it's important to be mindful of these situations. We don't want to choose a pleasant activity, and the whole time we're engaged in that activity, we're thinking about, well, it's going to end soon, so what's the point? Or I don't deserve this anyway. Or, oh, now I'm going to be expected to do a whole bunch, and I'm not ready for that. We focus on being unmindful of those worries. Because whether or not someone deserves an experience is judgmental. We're letting go of that. That is something that we add to the facts, whether or not a person deserves positive emotion. We let those judgments go completely. And if we do have a person who feels that way, we ask them to do it anyway. Engage in a pleasant activity anyway, and engage in it over and over and over until you understand that you do deserve it. We also focus on accumulating positive emotions in the long term. So while we're increasing these pleasant events in the short term, we focus on what are our values and priorities for the long term. This is where building a life worth living truly comes into play, because we are making necessary changes so that we engage and fulfill our values more often. And we take time for everyone to think about, what are my values? Some people have not really given that much thought. What are my priorities? It can be absolutely anything. It can be relationships. It can be achievements, spirituality. Recently, integrity has been a huge value that's come up in our DBT group recently. Just behaving in a way that feels respectful and kind in our current circumstances. One of my clients said, which I loved, was integrity to her means acting as if someone was watching you, acting in that way all of the time, even when nobody is watching. And Spirituality is something that someone can value and fulfill if that is important to them, or contributing to the community. So when we take the time to think about those values and those priorities, we can then break it down to what action steps can you take to engage more in that area, to build those areas of your life up. And this takes a lot of time and patience and persistence. But again, it's so worth it because this is where the meaning and the fulfillment comes from. So moving on to building mastery, this is building that sense of accomplishment, that sense of confidence in ourselves, where we can now see what we're capable of. We can now see, wow, I'm much more competent, or I'm much more resilient than I initially realized. So this comes from doing what we call something that's a little bit hard. So it's not impossible. It's not so difficult that all a person is going to feel is the failure. And it's not so easy that it doesn't seem challenging, or it doesn't seem like we did anything different. It's right there in the middle. It's difficult, but possible. And this will be different for everybody. So we want to build that sense of confidence. And we know that when we are confident and when we are feeling competent, we are much more resistant to depressive symptoms and those other negative emotions that we feel. And we can build up this positive self-concept, increase our self-esteem, and build up that sense of capability. And again, these activities can be anything. I always give the example in our groups that my sense of mastery came from pumping my own gas because I grew up in New Jersey my whole life. And when I moved to Pennsylvania, it was this extremely scary thing to me. And I avoided it at all costs. I would map out gas stations that did it for me, so I did not have to do that. I would avoid it all the time. And so as simple as this sounds to a person who has been pumping their own gas forever, it's personal to me, and it gave me a sense of mastery. So it doesn't have to be, running 5 miles or participating in a triathlon. It can be anything that gives you that sense of accomplishment. We also talk about coping ahead. So we all tend to have situations which elicit that reactivity, that are very difficult. And we worry that we're not going to be very skillful because of how strongly we feel about it. So we take the time to figure out those situations. And we plan, how are we going to cope with the expected difficulties? And how are we going to cope well? So what are we going to do? And we not only plan for what we are going to do, but we tend to plan for the worst feared catastrophe. And this is one of my favorite skills because a lot of my experience in therapy before DBT has been talking about behaviors that we can use to be skillful, and what is the likelihood that your catastrophe is going to happen, but it still didn't feel like enough. And when we use Cope Ahead, we dive deep into that fear. We act and imagine as if your worst feared catastrophe is occurring. And then we have them imagine that occurring. And the good news is that we have so much research that tells us that imagining a situation fires the same parts of the brain that are engaged in when we are engaged in an actual activity. So this is a really safe way to practice a very scary thing. And it increases our likelihood that when we are in that situation, we automatically respond in the way that we rehearsed. So it's bringing up all of the same emotions. It's bringing up all of the same fears. And we are sitting with them in that moment, coaching them and rehearsing with them. Yeah, this is what you're going to do. This is what you said would be helpful. So imagine doing that. And then what happens? And imagine coping with that. So we plan ahead in dealing with very emotional scenarios, very threatening kinds of situations. So it's this adequate preparation for this very scary situation. And we go in it with a plan that we've already rehearsed over and over, which also increases our ability to then perform that behavior that we've rehearsed and do very well with a situation we were extremely afraid of. So this brings me to our physical resilience, the taking care of your mind by taking care of your body. We know that an out of balance body really increases our vulnerability to negative emotions. So we need to make sure that we are treating physical illness, balancing how we eat, avoiding any mood-altering substances, getting enough sleep, getting enough exercise or physical activity. As Dr. Campbell noted in his presentation, this is one of the legs of the stool. That resilient biology is important. Once that goes away, we are already going to have a tough time coping. We remember this with the please word. The please skill is what we call it. And one of the first things we ask when someone is in a crisis, have you eaten? How are you sleeping? Or are you taking your medication as prescribed? Are you feeling okay? Are you ill? Are you sick? Most of the time, the answers are that one of those areas are not being fulfilled that well. And by focusing on that, by getting enough sleep, let's say, you already have built a firmer foundation to cope with that crisis and cope with it well. So as I said, we have lots of ideas here for coping strategies or ways to increase pleasant events or positive emotions in the short term. I broke it down by category, and these are all things that we can mostly do during a global pandemic that we are in. And activities can be anything. I jotted down a few ideas, but again, the increasing positive emotions is about finding what feels good to you. And if you don't know, it's okay to pick and choose. It's okay to try things out. Be mindful of, do I like this? And if not, okay, let me pick something else. And building on those activities. We have contributing, especially in the time that we are in now. Helping someone else also helps ourselves. So even just calling a friend, helping a neighbor, making a card for someone. We talked about creating a different emotion. Movement can be amazing here. We know that exercise is fantastic for depressive symptoms. The hardest part is starting, but once we're going, and especially at the end, fantastic. It does wonders. So yoga, even stretching, dancing. Dancing with my children in my kitchen at a random moment in the day has been one of my favorite types of movement these days, because it gets us out of our routine. It gets us out of our, let's move on to the next thing and the next thing. And it just allows you to just be in that moment. So a hand massage, jumping jacks, can be anything. Soothing your senses. Again, warm shower or a bath. Putting on some very comfortable clothing, making tea or coffee. And being kind to yourself. Sometimes we underestimate how important self-validation is. Sometimes we spend a lot of time validating others, and we forget to do that for ourselves. And just the statement of, this is hard, and I am doing the best I can mean a lot. And sometimes when we're in a crisis, we do the opposite. We beat ourselves up. We're not that nice to ourselves. We blame ourselves or we judge ourselves, and we're very critical, which again increases our suffering. So just the thought, I can get through this, can make a drastic shift in how we feel. I also included some ideas for when it is extremely hard. So sometimes we need more. Sometimes engaging in a pleasant activity is just not enough. So the ideas that I've included are part of what we call in DBT the tip skill. So it is tip the temperature. And what that means is dipping your face in ice water for 30 seconds. It is a very quick way to drastically reduce our physiological reactivity. Our breathing slows down. Our heart rate slows down. We become calmer. It evokes what's called the dive response in us, the same response that happens when we dive into very cold water. It's temporary. It's not going to make you feel great the entire day. The purpose of it is it gets you calm enough so you can think, what do I need to do next? Intense exercise, as I've said, is another way to really change up our physiology. We also have paced breathing and paired muscle relaxation. So these skills are geared toward targeting our physiological response, our muscles, our breathing, our tension, and truly relaxing. And if the self-soothing and the distraction does not work, the skills that I mentioned earlier, we talk about how to improve the moment. Whether that is imagery or creating meaning out of our suffering, prayer, relaxing activities, focusing on one thing in the moment, not getting overwhelmed by everything that is coming next. Because we can manage this one moment. We may not know how we're going to manage the next 6 hours or 12 hours or 1 week, but we can totally manage this moment. And when the next moment gets here, we'll deal with that too at that time. Vacation. Taking a vacation here means a day of turning your phone off. A day of relaxing in bed. It's allowing yourself that break. And again, this is a strategic vacation. It's not avoidance. It's not throwing up your hands and saying, I'm just not dealing with anything. It's allowing yourself the space. And encouragement, which goes along with the self-validation. It's giving ourselves the boost and the encouragement that we can do this. We can make it through hard things. We've done it before and we can do it again. It's a shift in how we talk to ourselves. If we don't have a support system that is cheerleading us along, we can do it for ourselves. It's a much better alternative than criticizing or judging or blaming ourselves. So in conclusion, I have included a summary of what we talked about and some of my favorite dialectical statements, I'll call them. So we can accept reality even when it's painful, and at the same time, we can work to change it. We can practice problem solving, and we can practice problem acceptance. We can do both at the same time. We can be tough and we can be gentle. We can be independent and we can also need help. And we can grieve and we can be resilient. Part of being resilient is allowing our emotions to be what they are, without shutting them down, without denying them, or without wishing they were different. Being mindful of how we feel gives our emotions the space to come and go as needed. So I want to thank you for allowing me the time to present today. And at this time, if there are any questions, I would be happy to answer.
Thank you, Kara, for this wonderful, soothing, informative presentation. We have a couple questions that I'd like to propose to you, okay?
Mm-hmm.
The first one is, could you please provide some suggestions on how to implement skills when someone is completely overwhelmed?
Yes, so the suggestion I would give is, it sounds like that person is at a skills breakdown point. So the first suggestion I would give is the ice water technique, because when we are overwhelmed, we truly cannot think of what to do next. We cannot implement a complicated skill. We may not even be able to remember what the skills we know are. So a quick suggestion that we give is either an ice pack, a bowl of ice water, or even ice on your face if that's the only thing that you can do. That is a very quick way to get our system regulated so we can think clearly as to what we can do next. So that would be the ice water portion of the tip skill.
Okay, thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
The next question is, how do we apply these skills for someone who has had a recent traumatic loss? And are there recommended skills during a crisis?
Yes, so all of the crisis survival skills would be the skills I would suggest to use during a crisis. And for someone who has had a traumatic loss, which is many of our members in our DBT program currently, we focus on the behaviors that are occurring in ourselves after the trauma that is interfering with our ability to function. In our program, we have a stage 2 where we actively do trauma work. And what we focus on first is getting a person who has experienced a trauma regulated enough and built up with skills so that when we do the active trauma work, they are not flooded with emotion. They know how to handle what is coming up. They they're coping better. They are more resilient, which allows them to actually work through the trauma more effectively.
Would we also use them during a crisis situation?
The skills?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. We would use the crisis survival skills during a crisis situation, so we don't make the crisis worse.
Okay. Next question is, can you provide an example of how to cope ahead?
Yes. So one of the examples that I can think about would be you have a difficult interaction that you have coming up, or you have a relationship that is extremely difficult that you need to interact with this person in some way. This is a common example in our group of using Cope Ahead. One of the first step would be to think about what am I going to say? What is my posture going to look like? What is my eye contact going to look like? And where am I going to have this conversation? And once we have that scripted, we then think about what is the worst thing that could happen from this interaction? What is your most feared catastrophe? Is it something the other person is going to say and do? Is it something that you are going to say and do? Or is it something separate? And that is individual for each person. But whatever that most feared catastrophe is, we write that down and we imagine that occurring in our minds. We rehearse that occurring. So say that example is this person yelled at me and cursed at me and stormed out of the room. We imagine that occurring. We imagine, what is that person saying to you? How are you coping effectively with it? What can you do if that happens? And so then we rehearse not only the most feared catastrophe, but what that person is going to do if that catastrophe occurs. And it's effective behavior. So how are you going to be most effective if that happens?
Thank you for all these great skills and for this wonderful presentation. We have more questions, but we're going to hold off on them now and answer them, hopefully maybe at the end of the program, or we can post them. So we're going to move on. But again, thank you again, Kara, and I'm going to turn it over to Sharon.
Thank you.
Yes, I echo Nancy's statements. Thank you. And it was a great presentation, and you just have a calming presence about you. So it's also just nice to listen. Our next presenter in the lineup here is Chris Thompson. He is a clinical social worker, and he is responsible for crisis services at Lenape Valley Foundation. So Chris has a lot of experience in crisis and clinical work, and he's also one of the tri-chairs of the Bucks County Suicide Prevention Task Force. So we have been interested, as well as all of you, I'm sure, of how is telehealth and doing things remotely impacting the work that we do around suicide prevention and intervention. So Chris is going to speak to that.
Thank you, Sharon. Hi, everybody. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to present today. I think it's official that Kara has to present prior to me presenting moving forward, because that was such a relaxing presentation to have before you have to present yourself. So thank you, Kara. That was a great job. And thank you, Frank Campbell, Dr. Campbell, for his presentation. So we're going to jump right in. I have a lot of information that I want to go over.
Chris, you're muted. Again.
Can you hear me now? Okay, I'm going to be going over the top 3 platforms that we've been using in telehealth service delivery, talk about the importance of professionalism and maintaining self-control within a session, and then we'll talk about how to support clients in suicide treatment and telehealth sessions. Have you participated in any telehealth appointment with any healthcare provider in the last 7 months? This should come up on your screen and you should be able to answer, and we'll get a quick answer here in less than 20 seconds. Just waiting for the answers to come up here. Maybe 5 more seconds. Okay, here are the answers. So as you can see, almost 72% have, yes, participated in a telehealth session. That's great. Next. Oh, sorry, jumping ahead here, my bad. Have you ever participated in a telehealth appointment with mental health provider in the last 7 months? So now we're asking if you've participated in a mental health, behavioral health session with a provider in the last 7 months. About 15 more seconds. Five seconds. Okay, so the answer for the vast majority of it is no. But as you can see, about 36% have participated in a telehealth appointment that was oriented around behavioral health services. Last question. If you had the opportunity to utilize behavioral health services in the future, how likely would you be to do so? About 15 seconds. Ten seconds. Okay, here come the answers. So as you can see, overwhelmingly, 67% of the crowd has said somewhat likely, or 22% said highly likely. So these are good numbers. And this is very similar to what we've seen here at Lenape Valley Foundation. We produced a survey that we sent out to a lot of our clients, and we got a decent response. About 112 responded. And the first question was, getting services on telehealth meets your needs. And as you can see, the vast majority of folks who responded said yes, that it did, strongly agreed or somewhat agreed. We also asked the question, would you prefer telehealth in-person services in the future? Would you prefer telehealth services over in-person services in the future? And as you can see, we have a split here, but we still have strongly agree, and some said strongly disagree. But generally speaking, we have the vast majority saying that they would engage in this type of service in the future. Am I open to a combination of virtual or in-person services? And as you can see, the vast majority of individuals, roughly 60%, said yes, they would be. So I believe that telehealth is here to stay. Telehealth is something that is allowing us to reach our clients and bridge that gap in between service delivery and treatment. It reduces that leap that individuals experience from time to time when they need to get help for something that they're struggling with, whether it be suicidal ideation or other kinds of challenges in their life. So I took a look at some data here at Lenape Valley Foundation, and what I noticed was this data also kind of generalizes, and it's what other providers in the state and country are experiencing right now. But it's important to understand that during the height of the pandemic and stay-at-home orders, telehealth services really was imperative. Many organizations jumped to an online platform overnight over a weekend, and started providing services through these platforms. As you can see, we evaluated a lot of individuals in crisis. Kind of have a breakdown here of mobile crisis, what we experienced at the lower end of our county, and then the central part of our county. A lot of these services in site-based crisis were continued to provide in face-to-face, in person, wearing PPE and things of that nature, and keeping ourselves safe. A lot of the mobile crisis services were provided telehealth, over the phone, and evaluating individuals, and that was imperative. We heard time and time again that individuals preferred that method, and at the time of a stay-at-home order, it was what we had to offer. What this translated into is a lot of referrals to outpatient care. Some individuals still had to go inpatient for their symptomology and what they were faced at the time. But this really did translate into individuals getting the help they need. The second graph over here, LVF crisis dispositions, we had almost 400 individuals that were considered new referrals to outpatient care, meaning they hadn't had any service in the last couple of years or at all, that they self-reported. And what this translated into, as you can see here in this graph, this is our intakes at Lenape Valley Foundation during the height of the pandemic and stay-at-home orders. We just continued to see an increase in individuals seeking outpatient care and other levels of care for that matter within the organization. And other organizations across the state experienced the same kind of influx and intake of new individuals seeking treatment. Okay, so pre-COVID-19, the state of behavioral health in our country and our nation was, we were experiencing long wait times for clients seeking service. Organizations were struggling with workforce shortages, trying to improve on recruitment strategies and ways of retaining staff. That became so important during the pandemic for some organizations that then started losing staff to COVID, either to quarantine or because they became sick themselves. And then of course there's the cost restriction associated with reimbursement rates, and how will this look in the future as we continue to utilize telehealth services to provide service. And then of course there was just the demand for behavioral health services prior to COVID. This data is from NAMI. 1 in 5 Americans experience some form of behavioral health challenge. And out of those 1 in 5, 60% did not receive any care in the last year. And then if we take a look at suicide numbers, we're talking a lot about today, 132 Americans die each day due to suicide. And about 1.4 Americans attempt suicide over a period of a year. So this great little chart that was offered up by Oxford University really kind of captures what we're facing today in a world dominated by COVID-19 and a pandemic. You know, the degree of uncertainty that many of us struggle with is real. You know, what does the future look like for us? The social isolation adds to that uncertainty. Not being able to connect with our loved ones and our family and friends can be a huge challenge and exacerbate those symptoms that we might develop from being isolated. And then the tremendous economic impact that is happening right now. I often think of some of our inner cities, particularly Manhattan, Brooklyn, the Bronx, hit very hard by COVID-19. And the economic impact will continue to pan out over the next couple of years. You know, but what this lends a hand to is those who are more vulnerable in our populations with pre-existing conditions that are associated with psychiatric illness, low levels of resilience. You know, it's so important what Kara just talked about, building resilience within yourself to maintain a level of stability. Very important. Individuals who you know, were hit hard by COVID-19 are going to continue to see this pan out in their communities over the next years and months. Of course, this can leads to exacerbation of depression, a great deal of anxiety. I think all of us can relate to the degree of anxiety that exists within us and within our communities right now. And then, of course, we're seeing an increase of substance use that can all lead to individuals considering suicide as a solution for the pain that they're experiencing in their life right now. So Dr. Campbell stole some of my thunder earlier. This slide uses the language of committed suicide, and that is something that we do not say anymore. I think Dr. Campbell did a great job of explaining why that is. That's a very old language, and I wasn't going to include the slide, but I felt like it gave me a great opportunity to say that. We say died by suicide. Committed suicide is old language, and it relates to suicide being a crime, essentially. But as you can see, the number of attempts of suicide, individuals who are attempting suicide with plans and without plans, we're going to continue to see an increase in suicide in this country, and we've already experienced that here in Bucks County. So we really have to do everything that we can to support the community in safety. So what are telehealth services? What are we talking about when we use the word telehealth? Well, it's any digital platform that we utilize to connect with our clients. This can be a mobile device, a cell phone, and that is a lot of what our clients use today. It can be a tablet, an iPad, any kind of electronic device that allows you to connect. Even a telephone is considered telehealth intervention. So it's important real quick to go over a couple little things. The Civil Rights Office and the Department of Health and Human Services put out a discretion during COVID virus for all of us. All companies that provide service to health companies are bound by HIPAA regulations. And it is important to make sure that your platform is abiding by those rules and you're providing a safe and secure platform to connect with your clients. It's also important to know that nefarious activities are not okay just because we're now working out of a online platform. It's important to note that certain public-facing platforms such as TikTok, Facebook Live, Twitch, these are all public-facing platforms. They have public chat rooms, and they're inappropriate for the use of telehealth services. Just have to be very careful with that we're not violating individuals' privacy. Okay, so the top 3 HIPAA-compliant platforms that we see being used today, Zoom. Everybody's on Zoom. We're Zooming. Zoom has become a part of our vernacular and is typically how we refer to this. We refer to it as Zooming. Microsoft Teams is being used a lot within organizations, not only to provide service, but as a platform for meeting and connecting. And then DoxyMe. DoxyMe has some really great features. One of them that sets it apart from the other 2 is an ability for clients to pay their copay after the session has been completed, which is a really nice feature. I encourage you to get comfortable with the platform that you choose to use. Each one has its own pros and cons and bells and whistles that make them favorable to you. And it's important that you take a look at that and see what works best. So what could possibly go wrong? Wear pants, please. Don't be this guy. Okay, behavioral health providers preparing for telehealth sessions. I can't express how much is important to test. Make sure that you're ready to go. You have everything that you need. And testing will help you troubleshoot issues that might arise. Wear the clothes that you typically would wear in a session, in a face-to-face session. Maintaining your professionalism is very important. Your scenery behind you is also what you're wearing. So make sure your space is clean, not cluttered, organized. This is going to help foster a sense of confidence and calm within your session. Check the lighting, make sure it's sufficient. Make sure you know what the lighting will do at the end of the day when the sun goes down. Try really hard to keep eye contact with the camera. This is something that I've been practicing a lot and it's challenging. I typically want to look at the screen, but then I'm not making eye contact with the individuals on the other end. Consider what programs you need to shut down. Shut down your email, other things that might pop up during your session that could be a distraction. Consider noises. It's becoming really popular right now. I think there's a run on keyboards that don't click when you type. For those of you who document during a session, concurrent documentation. Will you need a headset? Do you need to have privacy in that regard? Make sure you have your charger with you. Within doubt, your battery will die if you don't have it. And then I encourage everyone to develop a personalized checklist. This is a checklist that you can go through before you jump onto a session with somebody to make sure you're ready to go and you have what you need. Okay, what to consider for a telehealth session? I think it's important to make sure that the client on the other end has capability for webcam or smartphone. It's also important to consider your client's cognitive and clinical status. Are they able to participate? Do they need help participating? Particularly in a crisis situation if something goes awry. Also consider the technology that your client has available to them, and is it effective? Is the cell phone that they're using able to connect effectively? Make sure your client has the physical space for a private session. At times, the things that you might want to talk about, I'm sure is not something that wants to be broadcast in a home where others are available. Are you working with an adolescent or a teenager? Do you need a parent or guardian permission to do so? If you do, please acquire that and obtain that. And then, of course, please consider your client's safety in regards to suicidality and their risk. Plan accordingly with your client at the beginning of each session and every session after that. So preparing yourself. Keep calm, be prepared. Being prepared is the number one thing you can do so that you're calm and relaxed if something happens in a session that requires action. I have this little quote here from ProAct. The professional doesn't do a job, but chooses how to do it by taking responsibility for the disciplined management of attitude, mood, and motivation. I think many of the skills that Kara just reviewed with us are great skills to incorporate into your life and can be a part of how you prepare yourself for a telehealth session. Professionalism is number one. Remain professional at all times. Just because you're on a telehealth call with somebody doesn't mean that you don't have to maintain those boundaries that you would in any other face-to-face session. So an effective self-assessment allows you to evaluate where you are emotionally and how you might react in a situation that's really stressful during a telehealth session. For example, if someone expresses suicide behavior in the session, how will you handle that? The important thing about a self-control plan is that it interrupts that fight or flight response that we might have in a really intense situation. If someone is brandishing some kind of weapon or talking about means and has the means available right there in front of you on the video. And of course, remember to breathe. Again, I can't stress enough some of the techniques that Kara reviewed can be a part of your self-control plan that you utilize yourself as a clinician in a telehealth session to keep yourself focused and calm. So preparing your client for a telehealth session, it's really important. We've talked about this briefly, but I want to go into this a little bit more. So always have a backup plan in place. Talk about what you're going to do if the technology fails. Do either of you have access to a landline? I know that landlines are becoming less and less available in homes now, and people have just moved to cell phones. Cell phones are appropriate as well. Talk about who's going to call who if you get disconnected, and review that plan often so you make sure you're on the same. You and your client are talking about the same thing. It's not a bad idea to have a 5-minute practice session if possible. If not, I encourage you to reserve the first 5 minutes of your session to go over things related to the telehealth session so everybody becomes comfortable. The chat function is a really cool tool to be using in session. This is a place you can encourage your clients to take notes with. You can take notes yourself there and communicate back and forth. So I would encourage you to get comfortable with using that in a session. And then, of course, without a doubt, make sure that your client, again, is in that safe, quiet space wherever they're calling you from or connecting with you from. That will foster honesty and clarity within the session while you're conducting an assessment or providing therapy. Okay, so what things to think about. What if your client is struggling with a relationship and they're and that person is around during the telehealth session? Again, that's really important that you're in a private location. Maybe you can then suggest to your client to use a headset so that it can't be heard what's being discussed. It's important that you set the same boundaries that we have for in-person sessions about using tobacco products, substances, things of that nature, of course, are not allowed in a telehealth session either. It might seem a little ridiculous to have to review that, but I think there's a different sense when connecting to a provider in your own home. There might be an assumption that it's okay to have a beer during my therapy session. So make sure you address that ahead of time. Most important to address that ahead of time. So continue to screen all clients for suicide. This is very important. Here at Lenape Valley Foundation, we use the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. It's important that we continue to ask those questions at every session. You can review with your client that that's what we're going to be doing. And it's just another check to make sure everybody's well and healthy and safe, and that we do this because we care and want to provide the best service possible to individuals. It's important that we're reviewing our suicide safety plans. Things might have changed in that individual's plan because of COVID-19 and mitigation efforts. During the height of pandemic, we certainly experienced individuals not wanting to go to an emergency room or a walk-in crisis center out of fear of contracting COVID, which was realistic. That wasn't an unrealistic concern to have for an individual during COVID-19. So please review those plans and make sure that what is in place still works today, considering the mitigation efforts that are taking place in your community. Screen sharing can be a great way to do this. You can share your screen and have the safety plan right in front of you and the client, and you can go through the questions and talk about what the plan will look like for them. You can do the same thing with the suicide. You can do the same thing with the Columbia questions. You can put that up on the screen and review that with your clients at the same time. And this is very much in line with how Dr. Jobs talks about providing CAMs to a client, and that is that the two of you are kind of looking at suicide together collaboratively during the session. It's very important that we continue to engage our clients in counseling against access to lethal means. Currently, the country is experiencing a spike in firearm sales directly related to the pandemic. Firearms remain the #1 means used by individuals dying by suicide in the United States. And the vast majority of that is directly related to the improper storage of firearms in the home. So I encourage all of you, when you're conducting a safety plan, completing a safety plan with someone, that we're asking about weapons in the home and what they're doing to secure those weapons in the home. And please, if there's an individual that's identified on an individual suicide prevention plan as a support, please capture release for that individual and call that person and let them know. And that person might also have to be a part of this discussion about reducing access to lethal means within the home. So have that safety plan ready. Review it as often as you feel necessary. You know, it's really important that the plan that's in place works for the individual, considering everything that's going on. And things change. Things continue to change in regards to COVID-19 and mitigation efforts. It's also important as the provider that you have a contact person that you can reach out to during a session if things really go awry. That might be you're chatting somebody through a Teams platform, or you're texting them with your cell phone. During a really high risk scenario situation, and we've had a few of these happen here at Lenape, where an individual is threatening suicide in the moment, is showing means, a way in which they're going to carry through with that, which is a really intense situation that requires immediate response for that individual, and is going to require an emergency 911 call potentially to get someone to the scene immediately to provide safety for that individual. So make sure you have that safety person that you can call, as well as the clinician, that emergency contact during your session. So of course, in these situations, you might have to call 911 dispatch. You might not know the location of the individual. A lot of times when we get calls at crisis, we don't know exactly where the person's calling from. They could be in a car, they could be in a hotel, they might be at home. It's just not quite clear. So it's important that we're asking the individual, where are you located in the beginning of that call or session, so that you can locate them and send people to the location if you need to. In some situations, if the individual has a cell phone number, that can be really important to police and 911 dispatch. One situation that we had, we did not know where the individual was located. It was clear to the clinician who was providing the telehealth service that the individual was in a hotel. And I think that information was provided by the individual, the client that was being served, but they were not willing to give us an address. And we had to call 911 and ask for the authorities to ping that individual's cell phone. Today, with technology, they were able to locate that individual within about 15, 20 minutes, and then dispatch police to the scene to make sure that individual was safe. And the good news is that he was, and was continued to stay connected to service and work through his suicidality. You know, it's important that you take note on the background of the situation so that you can provide that information to emergency response teams. You know, colors of the car, what hotel it might look like, what the residency looks like, if you have any of that information. Really important to have so that you can forward on to the authorities. So high-risk crisis scenarios. A call to the crisis center is appropriate if the individuals continuing to express suicidal ideation, but is affirming their safety plan, but still needs further assessment. They're still concerned, but the individual's safe, and they're reporting to you that they're safe. If a client is struggling to engage in treatment and stay engaged in treatment, that can be a call to the crisis teams. They can reach out to this individual and work with them and talk about the difficulties they're having with staying connected to treatment. And then, of course, if the individual is in need of involuntary commitment, the crisis team can also help you out with that in your local community. Calls to 911 are those urgent wellness checks where the safety of the individual is intimate, and there's very much concern that something bad might happen if we don't get someone to the scene immediately. And that would include immediate threats of suicide or HI, homicidal ideation. Now, it's true that you might be calling 911 and asking for assistance to get someone to the scene immediately. And then you might also be following up with the crisis team to move forward with an involuntary commitment process. So you might have to call both, but in an emergent situation, don't hesitate, call police immediately. That would include any kind of injury that happened during a session that requires medical attention immediately. So A comprehensive crisis continuum of care is imperative. Many of you know I love this slide. Any opportunity I can slip it in somewhere, I do. And what we're talking about here is a robust crisis call center that can field calls from the community and direct service as needed. A robust mobile crisis team in the community that can respond in a timely fashion and is working hand in hand with CIT trained officers, which we have here in Bucks County. And this can lead to connecting clients in our community to the lowest, least restrictive level of care, which is imperative, and avoiding those psychiatric hospitalizations as much as we possibly can. So very important continuum of crisis care. So I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about therapeutic extenders during this time of utilizing telehealth platforms. We've reviewed these at our suicide prevention conferences in the past. I'm just going to kind of real quick talk about a couple of them, but I'm not really going to dig into them too much. I would encourage all of you to take a look at some of the apps that individuals can download on their cell phone as an extension to their therapy and treatment. My3 has a great way of storing emergency contacts and safety plans right in the app, so it's right at your fingertips. Same thing here with Suicide Safe, developed by SAMHSA. It's another great little tool. It also has a treatment provider locator. You can type in the address or a zip code of where you're at, and it can point you in the direction of help based on the location of where you are. The virtual help box was developed by the VA and is geared towards our veterans. This has it's filled with a bunch of great little videos that you can watch that inject a bunch of hope and stories about recovery from substance use and trauma that might be experienced during deployment. So this is a great little app that I would encourage all of you to utilize if you're working with veterans. And then by far, one of my favorite apps is called DBT. And this kind of goes back to Kara's presentation. If you're working with folks in a DBT model, I think this app is great for your clients to download. It's something that you can review in session as an extender of treatment after your sessions are over. There are different skills in here that help the client review them in the heat of the moment. Things like wise mind, being non-judgmental, ways of being mindful, and meditation. So there's just a great handful of little aspects of this app that are awesome for those working in a DBT model. So I would encourage all of you to take a look at these apps and consider utilizing them in your service provision. So final words, please practice, practice, practice. That is how you will be prepared when providing a telehealth intervention, and things will go smoothly if you have that in place. Be prepared for worst case scenarios. Things do happen and things do go wrong, so please be ready for that and know what your options are. Have your emergency response phone numbers ready to go, and who you will call in case there is an issue within that session that requires an immediate response. And then, of course, there's always needs to be a space in our world for in-person intervention if the suicide plans that we're working with someone are not working. That is something that we've continued to provide through the pandemic here at Lenape Valley Foundation. Our crisis teams, have to give them a shout out, just have done an awesome job with continuing to provide services through this pandemic and this difficult time in person. So that is my final words. Looks like I'm doing pretty good on time here. I think we'll have some time for questions. My references real quick. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in and being a part of our virtual suicide prevention conference. It's been great. I look forward to this every year, and I'm going to turn it over to Sharon for questions.
Well, yeah, I'm going to jump in, Chris.
Oh, sorry. There you go.
Questions. So we really appreciate you sharing your expertise in the areas of crisis services, telehealth platforms, and service delivery in this climate. So thank you very, very much. We have a few questions for you at this time, and I'm going to start with, is there a specific suicide assessment you would recommend using? If the Columbia scale, which version would you recommend using as a screening tool in outpatient therapy?
So I think the daily screener is sufficient for screening purposes. This screener allows you to ask questions about the individual's suicidal ideation. For example, are they thinking about a plan? Have they developed a plan? Have they taken steps to acquire pieces of that plan that they need? Acquiring rope, acquiring a gun or ammunition, or stockpiling medications. And then I think it's important that you screen for whether or not there's been any practice. Has the individual held the gun in their hand? Are they a gun owner? Have they ever held a gun to their head? Things of that nature are really important. That's an indication that there's been an act in furtherance, and it does speak to the degree of risk that is involved for that individual. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah. And can you speak to how you may be able to update safety plans as you go on to use them as a tool to address and solve problems?
Sure. So I think a safety plan is a living document, right? Just like treatment plans are a living document. I think should be a center piece of treatment, especially working with individuals who struggle with suicidality. So you'll want to have that safety plan present and ready to go for each session. And it's not a bad idea to review aspects of that to make sure you and the client are still in agreement and what's been listed in that plan is still going to work for that individual. Hopefully there are skills built into that plan, and you're reviewing those skills in session, and you're making sure the client is practicing those skills out of session, and if they're running into any barriers with utilizing those skill sets.
Okay.
And then Nancy, real quick, I just want to add, I can't stress how imperative it is that we're reaching out to those individuals listed as a support person in an individual safety plan to make sure they're aware that they're being listed. I've had some interesting things happen during that time where the client says, oh, I've never told that person that I'm suicidal. Well, that's important. Why have you not told that person? In itself, it can become a part of the treatment.
Yeah, that's a good point, Chris. And would we need releases for that person to talk to them during that time?
Absolutely. Capture releases for anybody that you're going to talk to in regards to your client's treatment.
Yeah, good point. So the next question is, what can we do if the person needs to go to the ER, but they are afraid to do so because of COVID?
So this is something that we've experienced, and I think it's a matter of staying connected with the individual, talking about alternatives to ways of keeping safe, that is the case. Unfortunately, if an individual is in need of inpatient psychiatric treatment, the gateway to that treatment typically is through an emergency room in the state of Pennsylvania. But there are other ways, and we have gotten creative and trying to work through direct admits directly with inpatient psych units. But I think, if a client is terrified of going to the emergency room, there are other ways to intervene. Mobile crisis could be an option for that individual, as well as if the suicide is really that significant and we're really concerned, as I said earlier, a face-to-face in-person session might be necessary. Here at the crisis centers, when we've evaluated people during the height of the pandemic and still today, what we have done is distanced ourselves. We require mask wearing. But if you provide a significant amount of space between each other and you're both wearing masks, it is possible to provide a face-to-face, in-person intervention during these difficult times.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, what is 23-hour crisis stabilization?
Sure, that's a great question. So 23-hour crisis stabilization is a way of giving a client time to kind of relax and decompress, hopefully calm down and relax. Maybe if they were using substances, to give them a period of time so they can sober up a little bit. This model is something that we see across the country being utilized more and more as a way of providing the crisis programs with time to evaluate that individual to see what the plan should be moving forward. For example, when they initially present, there might be a great deal of emotional dysregulation happening. They might be intoxicated, things of that nature. But providing them with time, 23 hours, you might see that the presentation of that individual is quite different after that time has elapsed. And then you might be looking at a lower level of care for that individual to support them through the crisis that they're experiencing. So that 23-hour observation time is really important. You can do a lot during that time. Sometimes there might be a need for medication administration. You can review and work out a really comprehensive safety plan. During 23-hour observations is a great time to get peer support involved. I think that's a huge aspect of Dr. Campbell's loss model, and that is that peer-to-peer relationship and being able to have a peer support available to say, I understand what you're going through. I've been there myself. And that connection can really help an individual regulate their emotions, feel more safe and secure in their situation, and develop a safety plan moving forward that doesn't include inpatient psychiatric treatment and can utilize a lower level of care, which is what we always want to aim for.
Okay, I have 4 questions left. I want to move back a little bit to the telehealth session. And can you talk a little bit about what if a client or consumer is using substances during the session and smoking or just maybe some at-risk behaviors, and how might providers handle that?
Well, the first thing I would say is it's important to evaluate the individual's degree of intoxication. If somebody's really intoxicated, just like you would in a face-to-face service, you might be ending that service and encouraging that person to sober up before you can continue. Now, if it's really serious, again, you might be in a situation where you do have to call for a safety check and get somebody out there to check on the individual. So it really depends on the degree of substance use and what's occurring with that individual and how you assess them being. I think it's important that you set up these expectations prior to getting into the actual telehealth session. That no smoking, no drinking, none of those things are continue to be unacceptable during a session. So reiterate that prior to your session, and I think you'll have better luck and hopefully won't run into that as much.
Okay, thank you, Chris. A couple easy ones here, I'm hoping. So does DoxyMe have a screen sharing capability?
That is a good question that I don't know the answer to, but I could certainly look into that. I am not sure.
Okay, we can get back to that and post that answer. The next question is, do you need to be certified in DBT in order to utilize the DBT app you showed us?
No, my understanding is you don't need to have a certification. This is an app that can be downloaded in your app store that we all have on our cell phones. So you do not have to be certified. Now, of course, as many of the DBT therapists we have here at Lenape Valley Foundation, there is a difference between DBT informed therapy, and that is talking about DBT and prepping someone for what DBT might be and how that could be a benefit for them. And then, of course, the actual provision of DBT services and a certified program.
Okay. And I did get an answer for the DoxyMe that it doesn't allow screen sharing in the free version, only in the paid version.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, so last question, Chris. So Chris, thanks for the presentation. I'm hearing that some of the major providers are pulling their access to telehealth appointments. Do you have any advice for anxious consumers who are worried about losing this benefit? Like what type of conversation they should have with their insurance provider?
Yes, I would encourage everybody that enjoys this way of being connected to advocate and speak to your insurance provider and let them know that you want to continue to be able to have this connection to your provider. I think there's going to be some form of hybrid down the road that we will see develop in our world, not just in mental health, behavioral health, but I think in health provision altogether. And that will be, if you prefer to have an in-person session, you can have that as well. And if you prefer to have a telehealth session, that would be available to you as well. And maybe you engage in some kind of combination of that. But I encourage everybody to get out there and talk about how successful it has been for you. If you've had a success story, those are the kind of stories that I think push stakeholders to consider this moving forward. I really don't see how we could move back at this point. When we talk about access to care and open access to care, telehealth has provided a streamline to service. And as I said earlier in my presentation, has reduced that leap that clients feel they're making when they seek services for a behavioral health concern or a behavioral health challenge that they're experiencing. We want to make it as easy as possible for people to get treatment. No barriers, reducing those barriers as much as possible. And I don't see much better of a way than someone being able to jump onto a Zoom meeting or a Doxy meeting with their provider right from their living room or kitchen or car, or maybe even their backyard. So I really believe telehealth is here to stay in some form. And please continue to advocate for its success and utilization in your own life with the stakeholders that support you.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Chris. And we appreciate all the questions. And I'm going to turn this over to Sharon Kern.
All right, thank you. Well, we're at the end of our morning here. I have some information to hand out. I will say, to follow up on Chris's last statements about advocacy, often when you're the insured person, your advocacy carries a lot of weight with insurance companies. And so around telemedicine in particular, I would say that's an area where we do need to advocate that it's had real value, and hearing your story and your particular circumstances are probably what would, it certainly could make a big difference, I would say. All right, so in wrapping up, I want to say thank you to all of our presenters. I found each of the presentations very interesting, everyone picking out little things here and there that I'm thinking, ooh, how can we do this? I will say that the venue, while I like being with everyone at the university, at Delaware Valley University, it worked. And so once again, I think we're seeing that we can do this. It speaks to the power in our county that we can get 200 people online for a topic of suicide prevention, which is really encouraging for our future in our work in this area. Some housekeeping things that I need to tell you about is, first of all, our presenters have agreed to share slides, and so those will be available in PDF version and will be emailed out. I'm also reminding you that the SurveyMonkey link will be, has been sent out in the chat. And I think we'll also have a link on the screen here at some point. Certificates, you remember it's the last question on the SurveyMonkey where you get your certificate today. There are a few people in the background today that I need to thank profusely, which are Suzanne Roadside and Jessica Bollard, our development department at Lenape. Again, a thank you to the Suicide Prevention Task Force for helping fund this event, as well as Lenape Valley Foundation funding it. And I would say, next year, I really hope that we're in person, that we're able to do breakout sessions and have our whole day like we have in previous years. It encourages me that we'll have even more participants next year. I think that you'll hear more about loss work in our county, and our hope to do some more real-time meeting with people after there's a death. And so, hopefully this will get us a new initiative and kind of headed down that road, which we're all very invested in. And I'm going to make sure, Jessica, I know that you're on the line. Is there anything else that I'm forgetting?
No, I just would ask everybody to go into the chat, access the SurveyMonkey link. That is your course evaluation and will take you again to your certificates. If you have any questions after the conference, you can email info, INFO, at Lenape, V as in Victor, F as in Frank.org. And we can help with any issues that people may have post-conference.
Alrighty then. So thank you to everyone. We are wrapping up, and please fill out your survey to get your continuing ed. And again, thank you to all of our presenters. And we'll see you next year at this conference.